Chapter 1. The Elf Who Knew Too Much. The dampness of the ministry-holding cells seeped through the stone walls like a living thing, carrying with it the metallic taste of despair and the acrid smell of magical restraints. Winky pressed herself against the cold barrier that separated her from the boy she had raised, her large tennis-ball eyes reflecting the dim wand light that flickered overhead. The guards had not noticed her. House elves were furniture to them, invisible until needed, forgotten the moment they looked away. But Winky was not forgotten by the young man who sat hunched in the corner of his cell, his dark hair matted with sweat, his eyes wild with the aftershocks of veritaserum. Barty Crouch Jr. had been many things to many people, Death-Eater, prisoner, imposter. But to Winky, he would always be the frightened child who had clung to her robes during thunderstorms, who had whispered his fears into her pointed ears when his father was too busy conquering the world to notice his son drowning in it. The magical bond between house elf and family was not something the wizarding world understood. Not really. They saw it as servitude, as blind devotion born of ancient magic and centuries of conditioning. They did not see what Winky felt now. The sharp, cutting pain of Barty's anguish, the way his memories bled through their connection, like water through a cracked cup. They did not know that when the auras had forced veritaserum down his throat, Winky had tasted every bitter drop. She had felt his mind split open like a ripe fruit, spilling secrets that should have died with him. Or she had experienced his confession as if it were her own, each word dragged from his lips by magical compulsion, echoing in her consciousness with the weight of absolute truth. The auras had taken notes, official documents that would be filed away and forgotten. They had what they needed, confirmation that Barty had been the imposter, that he had manipulated the Triwizard Tournament, that he had delivered Harry Potter to his master like a wrapped gift. But they had not stayed for what came after. They had not heard the other truths that tumbled from his lips once the questioning turned to his father, to the years of hidden imprisonment, to the conversations he had overheard from his place of magical captivity. Winky had heard every word. "Master Barty," she whispered, her voice so quiet it barely disturbed the stagnant air. "Ted Winky is here." His head turned slowly, as if the movement caused him pain. When their eyes met through the bars, she saw recognition flicker there. Not the mad gleam that had terrified the auras, but something softer, more human. Something that remembered being 5 years old and afraid of the dark. "Winky." His voice was a rasp, roughened by hours of forced confession. "They made me tell them. They made me tell them everything." "Winky knows, Master Barty." She pressed closer to the bars, her small hands wrapping around the cold iron. "Winky feels what Master Barty feels, always has." It was true. The bond between them ran deeper than most understood, forged not just by magic, but by shared suffering. While his father had built an empire of laws and regulations, Winky had been the one to tend the emotional wreckage he left behind. She had been there for every harsh word, every impossible expectation, every moment when young Barty had learned that love was something to be earned through perfection, and fear was the price of failure. "He knew," Barty said suddenly, his eyes focusing with an intensity that made Winky's heart clench. "Father knew what Dumbledore was planning. He knew before the tournament ever began." Winky's breath caught. This was not new information. Not to her. She had carried this knowledge for months, a poisonous secret that had eaten at her like acid. She had been there, invisible as always, when Barty Crouch Sr. had met with Albus Dumbledore in the study of their family home. She had been polishing the silver, her ears tuned to every word as they discussed their careful orchestration of a young man's fate. The memory surfaced now with crystalline clarity, pulled to the forefront by the echo of Barty's veritaserum confession. She could see it again. The two men seated by the fire, their voices low but audible to ears trained by decades of service to catch every nuance of their master's moods. "The boy must face Tom eventually," Dumbledore had said, his fingers steepled before him. "It is unavoidable. The prophecy ensures that." "And your plan ensures he faces him unprepared," Crouch Senior had replied. "Isolated. Traumatized. You're gambling with a child's life." "I am gambling with all our lives," Dumbledore had corrected quietly. "Harry's suffering is regrettable, but it serves a purpose. He must be willing to sacrifice himself when the moment comes. He must see no other choice. And if he breaks before that moment arrives, then we find another way. But I must believe, that James and Lily's son has the strength to bear what we ask of him." Winky had frozen at her polishing, the silver goblet forgotten in her trembling hands. They were talking about Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who had unknowingly sparked her own connection to this nightmare. But they spoke of him like a piece on a chessboard, a tool to be shaped and wielded and ultimately sacrificed for the greater good. "The tournament will test him," Crouch Senior had continued. "If he survives it, if he proves capable of facing the challenges we place before him, then we will know he can face the final challenge," Dumbledore had finished. "Your son's participation is regrettable but necessary. He gives us the control we need to guide events." "My son is lost to me," Crouch Senior had said, his voice empty of emotion. "If using him serves the cause, then so be it." They had spoken of other things after that, contingencies and precautions, the careful manipulation of ministry policy to ensure the tournament proceeded as planned. But those words had burned themselves into Winky's memory with the weight of a curse. Harry's suffering is regrettable, but it serves a purpose. Now, sitting in the bowels of the ministry, while her young master's mind shattered under the weight of forced truth, Winky understood what she had to do. "Master Barty," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Winky heard them talking, father and the headmaster, before the tournament." His eyes sharpened. They're focusing on her with an intensity that reminded her of the brilliant child he had once been. "You were there." "Winky is always there," she said simply. "No one sees Winky. No one thinks house elves have ears to hear or minds to understand. But Winky understands." She told him then, in halting words, about the conversation she had overheard. She watched his face change as the implications sank in, watched him realize that his father's use of him had been part of something larger, more calculated than even his veritaserum addled confession had revealed. "They planned it all," he whispered. "Every moment of his suffering, every danger he faced. They planned it." "Yes," Winky said, and the word felt like swallowing glass. "They planned it, and they used Master Barty to make it happen." For a long moment, they sat in silence, at the weight of this knowledge settling between them like a physical thing. Barty leaned forward, his face pressing against the bars that separated them. "What will you do?" he asked. Winky looked at him, this broken young man who had been twisted into a weapon, who had been used and discarded by everyone who should have protected him. She thought of Harry Potter, barely 15 years old, bearing scars that had been deliberately carved into his soul. She thought of all the other children who might be sacrificed on the altar of the greater good if no one spoke for them. "Winky will tell," she said, and her voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. Someone must know. Someone must speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. They won't listen to a house elf. Then Winky will make them listen. She stood, straightening her tea-towel dress with a dignity that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as the drunk, dismissed servant from the Quidditch World Cup. Master Barty has been used. Harry Potter has been used. But Winky has been watching. Winky has been listening. And Winky remembers everything. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the threshold. "Winky." She looked back. "Be careful," he said. "They've killed to protect this secret. They'll kill again." She nodded once, solemnly. "Winky knows the danger, Master Barty. But some things are worth the danger." As she walked away, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, Winky felt something she had never experienced before. Not the magical compulsion that bound her to the Crouch family, not the desperate need to please that had defined her existence, but something deeper and more powerful. Purpose. She had spent her life serving others, cleaning up their messes, keeping their secrets, protecting them from the consequences of their choices. But this secret was different. This secret was a poison that would keep spreading, keep hurting innocent children, keep turning love into manipulation and protection into betrayal. This secret needed to die, and if that meant a house elf would have to stand before the most powerful wizards in Britain and tell them truths they did not want to hear, then that was what she would do. She had been invisible for too long, dismissed as inconsequential for too long. But Winky had ears to hear and a voice to speak, and she would not be silenced. Not this time. The corridors of the ministry stretched before her, leading up toward a world that had never seen her as more than furniture. But as she walked, Winky felt the weight of her decision settling around her like armor. She had been shaped by service, defined by submission, trained to be nothing more than a reflection of her master's will. Tonight, she would become something else entirely. Tonight, she would become free, and the wizarding world would never be the same. Chapter 2. An Unlikely Alliance. The summer air hung thick and golden over the burrow, carrying with it the scent of Mrs. Weasley's herb garden and the distant sound of gnomes being forcibly relocated from their preferred hiding spots. Hermione sat cross-legged on her borrowed bed in Ginny's room, surrounded by a fortress of books that she had managed to retrieve from Hogwarts before the term's abrupt end. The familiar weight of leather-bound volumes and the whisper of turning pages should have been comforting, but tonight they felt like inadequate shields against the memories that kept surfacing unbidden. Cedric Diggory's face, Harry's hollow eyes when he'd stumbled out of that maze, clutching a dead boy and babbling about Voldemort's return, the terrible silence that had followed his announcement, broken only by Fudge's stammered denials and Dumbledore's grim acceptance of what they all knew to be true. The war was starting again. The war had never really ended, perhaps, but now it was crawling back into the light, and Hermione felt the familiar ache of helplessness that came with being 15 and brilliant and utterly without the kind of power that mattered when darkness was rising. She turned another page in magical law and its applications, though the words might as well have been written in ancient runes for all the sense they were making tonight. Her mind kept drifting to practical concerns, how to research protective charms that weren't taught in school, where to find information about fighting dark wizards when the ministry was actively suppressing such knowledge, how to prepare for a war that the government was pretending wasn't happening. It was past midnight when the soft pop of apparition, or something very like it, made her look up from her books. A house elf stood in the center of the room, her large ears drooping with exhaustion, and her tea-towel dress rumpled as if she had been traveling for hours. Hermione recognized her immediately. Winky, the Crouch family elf who had been dismissed after the Quidditch World Cup. She looked smaller than Hermione remembered, more fragile, but there was something different in her posture, a straightness to her spine that spoke of newfound determination. "Miss Granger," Winky said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Winky must speak with you." Hermione set down her book carefully, her mind immediately cataloguing the strangeness of the situation. House elves could apparate past Hogwarts wards, but the burrow should have been equally well protected. More importantly, why would Winky seek her out? Their only previous interaction had been at the World Cup, and Hermione's attempts to help had been met with the typical house elf resistance to liberation. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the empty space on the bed. "Please, sit down. Are you all right? You look exhausted." Winky remained standing, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. "Miss Granger is kind, but Winky cannot rest. Not yet. Winky has come because Miss Granger speaks for house elves, Because Miss Granger believes we should have rights." The words carried a weight that made Hermione's chest tighten. She had spoken for house elf rights, loudly and often, though her efforts had been met with everything from mild amusement to outright hostility. Even the house elves themselves had rejected her help, clinging to their servitude with a devotion she found both heartbreaking and infuriating. "I do believe that," she said carefully. "I believe you deserve to be treated as equals, to have choices about your own lives. Is that why you've come?" "Not for Winky," the elf said, and there was something in her voice that made Hermione lean forward. "For the children. For Harry Potter, and all the children who will suffer if Winky stays silent." The mention of Harry's name sent a chill down Hermione's spine. "What do you mean? What children? Winky, what's wrong?" For a moment, the elf seemed to struggle with herself, her large eyes darting around the room as if she expected to be interrupted at any moment. Then, with visible effort, she straightened her shoulders and met Hermione's gaze directly. "Winky knows things," she said. "Terrible things. Things that powerful wizards did to Harry Potter. Things they planned from when he was just a baby." Hermione felt her heart begin to race. "What kind of things?" Master Barty Crouch Jr. is in ministry holding," Winky began, or her words tumbling over each other in their urgency. "They gave him Veritaserum, made him tell them about the tournament, about how he pretended to be Professor Moody. But they left after they got what they needed for their reports. They did not stay to hear what else he said." "What else?" Hermione's voice was barely a whisper. "He told them about Father, about Master Crouch Sr. He told them about the meetings with Dumbledore, about the plans they made together. Plans for Harry Potter." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Hermione gripped the edge of the bed, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to consider. "Plans? What plans?" Winky took a shuddering breath. Winky was there when they met. Winky heard them talking in the study. She was polishing the silver, invisible like always, and they spoke as if she was not there. The elf's voice took on a flat, reciting quality, as if she were repeating words that had been burned into her memory. "Master Dumbledore said the boy must face the Dark Lord alone. He said Harry Potter's suffering was regrettable, but it served a purpose. He said the boy must be willing to sacrifice himself when the time comes." Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. "He said what?" "Master Crouch Sr. said they were gambling with a child's life. Master Dumbledore said he was gambling with all their lives." Winky's voice grew stronger, more certain. "He said Harry Potter must see no other choice but to die for them." The books scattered to the floor as Hermione shot to her feet, her mind reeling. This couldn't be true. This couldn't be real. Dumbledore was the leader of the light, and the man who had defeated Grindelwald, the only wizard Voldemort had ever feared. He couldn't. "When did this conversation happen?" she demanded. "Before the tournament, months before. They planned it all, Miss Granger. They used Master Barty to make sure the tournament happened as they wanted. They wanted Harry Potter to face danger, to suffer, to be ready to die when they asked it of him." Hermione sank back onto the bed, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The implications were staggering, horrifying, impossible to fully grasp. If what Winky was saying was true, then Harry's entire life had been orchestrated, his suffering carefully calibrated to produce the perfect martyr. "The Dursleys," she whispered, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Harry's relatives who starved him and locked him up. But Dumbledore placed him there. He had to have known." "Master Dumbledore knows many things," Winky said sadly. "He sees far, plans deep. But he thinks of people as pieces on a chessboard, not as children who cry in the dark." Hermione felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced them back. This was not the time for grief or anger. Not yet. If this was true, if even part of it was true, then Harry was in more danger than any of them had realized. Not just from Voldemort, but from the people who claimed to protect him. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why not go to the Aurors, or who would believe a house elf?" Winky interrupted, her voice bitter. "Winky is dismissed, disgraced. She drinks butterbeer to forget her shame. Who would listen to such a creature? But you think I will?" "Miss Granger speaks for those who have no voice," Winky said simply. "Miss Granger believes house elves can think and feel and deserve to be heard. Perhaps Miss Granger will believe that house elves can also tell the truth about the powerful wizards who think they own the world." Hermione stared at the small elf, seeing her properly for the first time. Not as a victim to be saved, or a cause to be championed, but as an individual making an incredibly brave choice. Winky was risking everything, her safety, her life, what little security she had left, to speak for a boy who probably didn't even know she existed. "What do you want me to do?" Hermione asked. "Help Winky find a way to make them listen," Winky said. "Winky cannot read the law books, cannot understand the complicated words wizards use to hide simple truths. But Miss Granger can. Miss Granger can find a way to make them hear what Winky has to say." Hermione looked at the scattered books around her feet, then back at Winky's desperate, determined face. The helplessness she had been feeling evaporated, replaced by something sharp and focused. This was something she could do. This was research with a purpose, knowledge that could save lives rather than simply satisfy curiosity. "House elf testimony," she murmured, her mind already racing through legal precedents and magical law. There would be precedent for it. House elves are magical beings. They're bound by truth magic in their bonds to wizarding families. If we could prove that your connection to the Crouches makes your testimony legally admissible— "You believe Winky?" the elf asked, hope flickering in her enormous eyes. "I believe you're telling the truth as you understand it," Hermione said carefully. "And I believe that Harry deserves to know if people are making plans for his life without his consent, regardless of their intentions." She stood again, purpose lending strength to her movements. "We'll need to research this properly. House elf rights in magical law, precedents for magical creature testimony, the legal framework of the Wizengamot." She paused, looking at Winky with new respect. "This won't be easy. If what you're saying is true, we're talking about challenging some of the most powerful people in the wizarding world, or they won't simply let us expose them. Winky knows the dangers," the elf said quietly. "But some things are worth the danger. Children should not be sacrificed for the greater good, not even for wars." Hermione felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that this was bigger than SPEW, bigger than her academic pursuits, bigger than anything she had ever attempted. This was about justice, about truth, about refusing to let power hide behind good intentions. "We'll need help," she said. "Ron and Harry should know about this, and we'll need legal counsel, someone who understands magical law better than I do, someone willing to take on a case that could destroy their career." "Miss Granger will help Winky find these things?" "Yes," Hermione said, and the word felt like a vow. "Yes, I'll help you. We'll help you. And because you're right, some things are worth the danger." Winky's face crumpled with relief, and for a moment she looked like nothing more than a frightened creature who had been carrying a burden too heavy for her small shoulders. "Winky thanks, Miss Granger. Winky has been so afraid, so alone with this secret. Winky thought she would die with it inside her." "You won't have to carry it alone anymore," Hermione promised. "We'll figure this out together." As she spoke the words, Hermione felt the weight of what they were undertaking settle around her like a cloak. They were about to challenge the most revered wizard in Britain, to accuse him of manipulating a child for his own purposes. They were about to give voice to a house elf who had no legal standing, no credibility in the eyes of wizarding society. But as she looked at Winky, small, brave, determined Winky, Hermione knew they had no choice. Harry had suffered enough. The wizarding world's children had suffered enough. If those in power would not protect them, then perhaps it was time for those without power to stand up and demand better. "Tomorrow," she said, already planning the research they would need to do. "Tomorrow we'll start building your case. Tonight, you should rest." Winky nodded, but she didn't disappear as Hermione had expected. Instead, she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small, battered notebook. "Winky has been writing things down," she said, offering the notebook to Hermione. "Since Master Barty was taken, all the conversations she remembers, all the dates and times. But Winky's memory is very good. House elves must remember everything their masters say." Hermione took the notebook with reverent hands. The pages were covered in cramped, uncertain handwriting, but the contents made her blood run cold. Dates, times, direct quotes from conversations that painted a picture of manipulation stretching back years. This wasn't just testimony. This was evidence. "Winky," she said softly, "this could change everything." "Winky hopes so," the elf replied. "Harry Potter deserves to choose his own fate. All children do." As Winky finally disappeared with a soft pop, leaving Hermione alone with the notebook and the weight of impossible knowledge, Hermione felt the last of her childhood slip away. Tomorrow she would become something new, not just a student or a campaigner, but a revolutionary, and the wizarding world would never be the same. Chapter 3. The Lawyer Who Listened. The Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement hummed with its usual bureaucratic energy, a carefully orchestrated symphony of quills, scratching parchment, interdepartmental memos fluttering through the air like confused paper birds, and the soft murmur of witches and wizards conducting the mundane business of magical justice. Tucked away in a small office on the department's third sub-level, Andromeda Tonks sat surrounded by case files that represented the forgotten corners of wizarding law, house elf disputes, magical creature rights violations, and the occasional discrimination case that no one else wanted to touch. She had learned long ago that the ministry's definition of justice often came with conditions. The important cases, and the career-making prosecutions, went to lawyers with the right surnames and the right connections. What remained filtered down to people like her, the disowned daughters of ancient families, the blood traitors who had chosen love over lineage, the idealistic fools who still believed that magical law should apply equally to all magical beings. Andromeda had made peace with her professional exile years ago. Her small practice kept her busy enough, and there was a quiet satisfaction in winning rights for beings that most wizards considered property. Besides, she had learned that the margins of society often revealed more about its true nature than all the grand courtroom dramas reported in the Daily Prophet. The knock on her office door came at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, just as she was reviewing a case involving a family of brownies who had been illegally evicted from their ancestral hearth. She looked up to see a young woman with bushy brown hair and an armload of books that looked heavy enough to topple a less determined person. "Excuse me," the girl said, peering around her literary fortress. "Are you Andromeda Tonks? I'm Hermione Granger. I was wondering if I could speak with you about a legal matter." Andromeda recognized the name. This was one of Harry Potter's friends, the brilliant Muggle-born witch who had been making waves at Hogwarts for years. More importantly, this was the girl who had survived the Triwizard Tournament's deadly conclusion and witnessed Voldemort's return. Her presence here, in Andromeda's forgotten corner of the Ministry, was intriguing enough to warrant attention. "Please sit down," Andromeda said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Though I should warn you that my specialty is magical creature law, not the sort of high-profile work that someone of your reputation might require." Hermione settled into the chair, balancing her books with practiced ease. "Actually, that's exactly why I'm here. I need someone who understands magical creature rights, and someone who—" She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "Someone who understands what it's like to be dismissed by people in power because of who you are." The words carried a weight that made Andromeda straighten in her chair. She had indeed been dismissed by people in power, first by her family for marrying a Muggle-born, then by the ministry's upper echelons for her choice of clients. This girl had done her research. "What kind of case are we talking about?" Andromeda asked. "House elf testimony," Hermione said. "I have a client who possesses information that could expose a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in Wizarding Britain. But she's a house elf, and I need to know if her testimony would be legally admissible before the Wizengamot." Andromeda felt her eyebrows rise. In all her years of magical creature lore, she had never encountered a case involving house elf testimony in a criminal proceeding. What sort of conspiracy? "The deliberate manipulation and endangerment of a minor," Hermione said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the accusation. "Specifically, Harry Potter. My client overheard conversations that suggest his entire upbringing was orchestrated to make him willing to sacrifice himself in the war against Voldemort." The words hung in the air like a curse. Andromeda found herself thinking of her own daughter, Nymphadora, barely 21, and already risking her life as an Auror. She thought of all the young people who had died in the last war, and all those who would die in the war that was beginning again. The idea that someone might deliberately cultivate a child's trauma to make them a more willing sacrifice was both horrifying and, unfortunately, believable. "That's a serious accusation," she said carefully. "Who are we talking about? Who would have the power and motivation to orchestrate something like that?" "Albus Dumbledore," Hermione said. "Wasn't Barty Crouch Sr.?" Andromeda felt the air leave her lungs. Challenging Dumbledore's actions was career suicide. He was beloved by the public, respected by his peers, and protected by a reputation built over decades of fighting dark wizards. But as she looked at the earnest young woman sitting across from her desk, Andromeda remembered another truth. Sometimes the most important battles were the ones that no one else was willing to fight. "Tell me about your client," she said. Hermione's entire posture changed, relief flooding her features. "Her name is Winky. She was the Crouch family house elf until she was dismissed after the Quidditch World Cup. She has perfect recall of conversations she overheard between Crouch Sr. and Dumbledore, was including specific plans for Harry's treatment and the tournament." "House elves do have perfect memory when it comes to their families," Andromeda mused, her legal mind already working through the implications. "Their magical bonds make it impossible for them to lie about their master's actions or words. In theory, that should make their testimony more reliable than that of most wizards." "In theory," Hermione repeated. "But in practice?" "In practice, house elf testimony has never been tested at the Wizengamot level," Andromeda admitted. "There are precedents for magical creature testimony. Centaurs, goblins, even ghosts have testified in certain cases. But house elves—" She trailed off, thinking. "The legal framework exists, but it's never been applied." "Would you be willing to apply it?" Hermione asked. "I should warn you. This case could destroy your career. The people we're challenging have the power to make life very difficult for anyone who opposes them." Andromeda laughed, though there was little humor in it. "Miss Granger, my career was destroyed the moment I married a Muggle-born wizard. What I have now is what I've built in spite of their disapproval. If you're right about this conspiracy, if children are being deliberately traumatized for political purposes, then career considerations become rather secondary." She stood, moving to a bookshelf lined with legal texts that most wizarding lawyers never bothered to consult. "Magical creature rights in wizarding law," she murmured, pulling down a thick volume bound in cracked leather. "Precedents and applications of non-human testimony. Well, here we are." The next hour passed in a blur of legal research and increasingly disturbing revelations. Hermione presented Winky's notebook, its pages filled with dates, times, and direct quotes that painted a picture of manipulation stretching back over a decade. Andromeda found herself cross-referencing magical law texts, looking for the precedents that would allow a house elf's memories to be admitted as evidence. "The Magical Beings Protection Act of 1631, she said finally, pointing to a passage in one of the ancient texts. It establishes that any magical being bound by truth magic cannot give false testimony about their binding family. The law was written to protect magical creatures from being forced to lie in court. But it works both ways. It also establishes their testimony as inherently truthful. So Winky's memories would be admissible? More than admissible. They would be considered magically verified testimony, Andromeda said, excitement building in her voice. But we would need to record her statement under formal magical oath, with witnesses present and proper documentation. Can we do that? Yes, Andromeda said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff. Yes, I think we can. I'll need a few days to prepare the paperwork and arrange for proper witnesses, but legally speaking, there's nothing to prevent a house elf from filing a complaint with the Wizengamot. 3 days later, Andromeda found herself in a small, secure room in the department's lower levels, surrounded by the formal apparatus of magical testimony. Winky sat across from her, looking almost impossibly small in the official witness chair, her large eyes reflecting the soft glow of the truth-compelling orb that hovered between them. The magical oath had been administered by a senior ministry official who had clearly wanted to be anywhere else, and the dictation quill hung suspended over an official parchment scroll, ready to record every word with the kind of magical accuracy that made perjury impossible. Please state your name and your relationship to the individuals named in your complaint, Andromeda said formally. Winky, the house elf said, her voice stronger than it had been during their preliminary meetings. Winky was house elf to the Crouch family. Winky served Master Barty Crouch Sr. for many years and cared for Master Barty Crouch Jr., since he was a baby. And you were present during conversations between Barty Crouch Sr. and Albus Dumbledore regarding Harry Potter? Yes, Winky said. Winky was always present when masters had visitors. House elves are invisible to wizard guests. They speak freely. What followed was 2 hours of testimony, so detailed and damning that Andromeda found herself checking and rechecking the truth-compelling orb to ensure it was functioning properly. Winky recounted conversation after conversation, stretching back to Harry's placement with the Dursleys as an infant, all the way through the careful orchestration of the Triwizard Tournament. The most devastating revelation came near the end of the session, when Winky described finding a cache of correspondence in Crouch Sr.'s private study. Master Crouch kept all letters from important people, Winky explained, filed by date in locked drawers. Winky had access because Winky cleaned and organized the study. Letters from Professor Dumbledore went back many years. How many years? Andromeda asked. Since Harry Potter was placed with his Muggle relatives, Winky said. Winky remembers because it was just after the Dark Lord fell, and Master Crouch was very busy then. The first letter arrived 3 days after Harry Potter was taken to Privet Drive. Andromeda felt her heart stop. If Dumbledore had been corresponding with Crouch Sr. since Harry's infancy, then this conspiracy was even more extensive than they had imagined. Did you read these letters? Winky cannot read wizard writing very well, Winky admitted. But Winky heard Master Crouch reading parts aloud during their meetings. Plans for Harry Potter's schooling, instructions for ministry policy regarding the boy, arrangements for his treatment. What kind of arrangements? Professor Dumbledore wrote that the boy's suffering must not be interrupted, Winky said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He said investigations into the Dursley family must be discouraged. He said Harry Potter must believe he has no one else to turn to. The room fell silent, except for the scratch of the dictation quill recording these terrible words. Andromeda looked at the official witness, a stern-faced witch from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes who had been assigned to monitor the proceedings, and saw her own horror reflected in the woman's expression. "Oh, Miss Winky," Andromeda said carefully, "are you prepared to swear, under magical oath, that everything you have testified today is true to the best of your knowledge and recollection?" Winky swears, the house elf said simply. Winky's magic is bound to truth when it concerns her masters. Winky cannot lie about what she has seen and heard. The formal conclusion of the testimony took another 20 minutes. Signatures, magical verification seals, and the careful documentation that would make this session a matter of official record. As the ministry witness departed with her copy of the transcripts, clearly eager to distance herself from what she had heard, Andromeda found herself alone with Winky and the weight of what they had just accomplished. "What happens now?" Winky asked. "Now I file a formal complaint with the Wizengamot," Andromeda said. "I request a full investigation into the allegations you've made, and I demand that Harry Potter be granted legal protection from further manipulation." "Will they listen?" Andromeda looked at the small house elf who had just spoken truth to power with a courage that most wizards would never possess. "They'll have to listen," she said. "That's the beautiful thing about magical testimony under formal oath. It can't be dismissed or ignored. They may not like what you've told them, but they can't pretend it isn't true." 2 days later, Andromeda stood in the office of the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, placing a sealed folder on his desk with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. The folder contained 43 pages of magically verified testimony, 17 pieces of supporting documentation, and a formal request for immediate investigation that cited 17 different precedents in magical law. "What is this?" the chief warlock asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "A complaint filed on behalf of Winky, former house elf, to the Crouch family, alleging conspiracy to endanger a minor and abuse of magical authority," Andromeda said calmly. "The complaint names Albus Dumbledore and Barty Crouch Sr. as primary defendants and requests immediate Wizengamot review." The silence that followed was absolute. "A house elf," the chief warlock said finally. "You're telling me that a house elf is accusing Albus Dumbledore of conspiracy?" "I'm telling you that a house elf has provided magically verified testimony regarding conversation she witnessed," Andromeda corrected. "Testimony that is legally admissible under the Magical Beings Protection Act and supported by physical evidence. Whether you choose to investigate these allegations is up to the Wizengamot, but you cannot legally dismiss them without review." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and I've sent copies to the Daily Prophet, the International Confederation of Wizards, and the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's Internal Affairs Division, just to ensure proper transparency." As she walked away, Andromeda heard the folder being torn open behind her, it followed by a string of curses that would have made her daughter proud. The case was officially filed now, and there was no going back. The wizarding world was about to learn that even the smallest voices could speak the loudest truths. And sometimes that was enough to bring down giants. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Department of Mysteries. The corridors of the Ministry of Magic's lower levels carried a different quality of silence than those above. Not the bustling quiet of bureaucracy in motion, but something deeper, more profound. It was the silence of secrets kept and knowledge buried, of power exercised in shadows where the public eye could not penetrate. Andromeda Tonks had walked these halls before, but never with the sense of purpose that drove her now, and never with the knowledge that she was hunting something that could reshape the very foundations of their world. 3 days had passed since she had filed Winky's complaint with the Wizengamot, 3 days of carefully worded inquiries and delicate navigation of ministry politics. The initial shock waves were already rippling through the building, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, meaningful glances exchanged between senior officials, and a sudden, telling interest in her case files from people who had never before acknowledged her existence. But more importantly, those 3 days had given her time to think, to plan, and to realize that Winky's testimony, devastating as it was, represented only the tip of a much larger iceberg. If Dumbledore and Crouch Sr. had truly been orchestrating Harry Potter's life since infancy, then there would be documentation. Men like that did not operate on verbal agreements and handshake deals. They created paper trails, official records, the kind of bureaucratic evidence that could survive decades and withstand legal scrutiny. The question was where such evidence might be hidden. The answer, when it came to her, was both obvious and daunting. The Department of Mysteries. The Ministry's most secretive division, responsible for the study of subjects so dangerous or sensitive that their very existence was compartmentalized away from the rest of magical government. If Dumbledore and Crouch Senior had wanted to keep their correspondence secure, to ensure it remained hidden from prying eyes while still maintaining official status, the Department of Mysteries would be the perfect repository. The problem, of course, was access. The Department of Mysteries did not welcome casual visitors, and Andromeda's position in magical creature law gave her no legitimate reason to request entry to their archives. She needed someone with connections, someone who understood the Ministry's labyrinthine bureaucracy and could navigate it without raising suspicions. She needed Arthur Weasley. Arthur had been surprisingly easy to convince, though perhaps that shouldn't have surprised her. The man who had opened his home to Harry Potter, who had treated the boy like one of his own sons, was not someone who would stand by while evidence of his manipulation came to light. When Andromeda had approached him in the leaky cauldron on a Tuesday evening, presenting him with carefully redacted portions of Winky's testimony, she had watched his face transform from confusion to horror, to a cold, quiet rage that reminded her exactly whose family he came from. "You're certain about this?" Arthur had asked, his voice steady, despite the fury in his eyes. "About all of it?" "The testimony is magically verified," Andromeda had replied. "Winky cannot lie about her master's words or actions. Everything she described happened exactly as she stated." Arthur had stared at the parchment for a long moment, then carefully folded it and placed it in his robes. "What do you need?" Now, 2 days later, Andromeda found herself following Arthur through the Ministry's service corridors, taking advantage of the lunch hour when most of the Department of Mysteries staff would be absent. But Arthur's knowledge of the building's less obvious pathways, gained through years of investigating magical artifacts that often ended up in restricted storage, had provided them with a route that avoided the main checkpoints and security protocols. "The correspondence archives are kept in Section 7, Arthur explained in a whisper as they descended another level. "Anything involving interdepartmental coordination or long-term policy planning gets filed there. If Dumbledore was working with Crouch Senior on official ministry business, there should be records." They paused at a junction where 2 corridors met, Arthur checking his pocket watch with the nervous precision of a man who understood that timing was everything. "Security change happens in 3 minutes, he murmured. "Or that gives us approximately 20 minutes before the next patrol." The Department of Mysteries archive section existed in a state of perpetual twilight, lit by orbs of soft blue light that cast everything in an otherworldly glow. Row upon row of filing cabinets stretched away into the shadows, each one bearing cryptic labels that spoke of projects and investigations spanning decades. The air itself felt heavy with secrets, charged with the kind of ambient magic that came from storing too much sensitive information in one place. Dumbledore correspondence would be filed under D for his surname, or H for Hogwarts-related business, Arthur said, moving with surprising stealth toward the appropriate section. Crouch Senior's files would be under departmental cross-references. He trailed off as they reached the filing cabinets, his expression changing from determination to confusion. Several of the drawers that should have contained relevant documents were not merely locked, they were sealed with ministry security charms that glowed faintly red in the dim light. "That's not standard archival security," Arthur said, pulling out his wand to examine the seals more closely. "These are the kind of protective charms they use for active investigations or highly sensitive political matters." Andromeda felt her heart begin to race. Security seals on correspondence files could mean only one thing. Someone else had been looking for the same information they were seeking. Either someone was already investigating the conspiracy, or someone was trying very hard to cover it up. "Can you break them?" she asked. Arthur gave her a look that was half admiration, half concern. "You're asking me to commit a serious crime, Andromeda. Breaking Ministry security seals is a felony that could land us both in Azkaban." "Harry Potter was 14 years old when he was forced into that tournament," Andromeda replied quietly. 14, and already being prepared for sacrifice. How many other children will suffer if we let this conspiracy continue?" Arthur studied her face for a moment, then nodded grimly. "Right. Stand back." The spell work required to bypass Ministry security was complex and delicate, requiring a combination of charm-breaking techniques and careful manipulation of the underlying magical matrices. Arthur worked with the focused intensity of a man who had spent years dealing with dangerous magical artifacts, his wand movements precise and economical. The seals dissolved with a sound like breaking glass, and the filing cabinet drawers clicked open with an almost audible sigh of relief. What they found inside made Andromeda's breath catch in her throat. Hundreds of documents, carefully organized and cross-referenced, spanning nearly 15 years of correspondence. Letters bearing the Hogwarts seal alongside official ministry letterhead, interdepartmental memos that discussed Harry Potter as if he were a military asset rather than a child, and detailed reports on his living conditions that read like surveillance dossiers. "Sweet Merlin," Arthur whispered, pulling out a thick folder labeled Potter, H.J., Placement and Monitoring. "Look at this. Weekly reports on his treatment at the Dursleys, going back to when he was 3 years old." Andromeda opened another file, her hands trembling as she read the contents. "Arthur, this one is dated November 1981, 2 weeks after Harry was placed with his relatives. It's from Dumbledore to Crouch Sr., discussing necessary adjustments to the boy's environment to ensure proper psychological development." She continued reading, her voice growing quieter with each terrible sentence. "The child's natural resistance to authority must be worn down gradually. Excessive comfort or affection will interfere with his willingness to sacrifice himself when the prophecy demands it. The Dursley family has been selected specifically for their ability to provide the necessary conditioning." Arthur's face had gone ashen. "Conditioning. They're talking about conditioning a baby." "There's more," Andromeda said, pulling out additional letters. "Plans for his Hogwarts years, or manipulations to ensure he faces specific dangers at predictable intervals. They wanted him to develop a savior complex, to become so accustomed to risking his life for others that he wouldn't question it when they asked him to die." The next document made them both fall silent. It was a letter dated just 3 months earlier, written in Dumbledore's distinctive handwriting and addressed to Crouch Sr. The contents were brief but devastating. "Barty, the boy's exposure to the tournament dangers proceeds as planned. Young Barty's performance as Moody has been exemplary. Harry is forming precisely the kind of emotional attachments that will make his eventual sacrifice psychologically inevitable. The boy's suffering will make him more willing to sacrifice himself when the moment comes. But we are nearing the end game. I trust your son understands the importance of his role in this final phase. The prophecy must be fulfilled, and Harry must choose death willingly. Everything we have built depends on his cooperation. A PWBD." Andromeda read the letter twice before its full implications sank in. Not only had they planned Harry's psychological manipulation, but they had knowingly used Barty Crouch Jr.'s infiltration of Hogwarts as part of their scheme. The tournament, the dangers Harry had faced, even the resurrection of Voldemort. It had all been orchestrated. "They knew," she said, her voice barely audible. "They knew Voldemort would return. They knew Harry would be there. And they planned it. They used Crouch Jr.'s obsession with his master to deliver Harry exactly where they wanted him." Arthur was frantically copying documents now, his wand movements almost frantic as he duplicated page after page of evidence. "We need all of this," he said. "Every letter, every memo, every report. This isn't just conspiracy. This is systematic child abuse, sanctioned at the highest levels of government. They worked in tense silence for the next 15 minutes, copying everything they could find and carefully replacing the originals to avoid immediate detection. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its thoroughness: contingency plans for different scenarios, backup methods of psychological manipulation if the primary approach failed, but even detailed analyses of Harry's personality development written by ministry-employed psychologists who clearly had no idea what their assessments were being used for. It was as they were preparing to leave that Arthur's pocket watch began to chime, their warning that the security patrol was approaching. They had perhaps 30 seconds to reseal the cabinets and make their escape before being discovered. Arthur's hands flew over the locks, hastily restoring the security seals with modified versions that would fool casual inspection, but wouldn't stand up to detailed scrutiny. It was imperfect work, rushed and potentially detectable, but it was the best they could manage under the circumstances. They were halfway down the corridor when the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, followed by voices raised in alarm. "Sir, at the archives. Someone's been in Section 7. Arthur and Andromeda broke into a run, abandoning stealth for speed as they raced toward the service exits. Behind them, security alarms began to wail, and the sound of pursuit grew closer with each passing second. They reached Arthur's office in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts department, just as the ministry-wide lockdown began, sealing the building and trapping everyone inside until the security breach could be investigated. Arthur immediately began casting privacy charms and detection-blocking spells, transforming his small office into a temporary sanctuary. "They'll know someone was in there," he said grimly. "And it won't take them long to figure out who has both the access and the motivation." "Then we need to move fast," Andromeda replied, pulling out the copied documents. "I need to get these to a secure location and begin preparing them for presentation to the Wizengamot. And I need to prepare for the inevitable questioning," Arthur said. "They'll come for me first. I'm the obvious suspect." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside grew louder, accompanied by the voices of security personnel conducting their floor-by-floor search. "Arthur," Andromeda said urgently, pressing a complete set of the copied documents into his hands. "Hide these. If they arrest me, if they manage to destroy what I have, these copies could be the only thing standing between Harry and years more of manipulation." Arthur nodded, quickly concealing the documents within a cabinet full of confiscated magical items where they would be virtually impossible to find without knowing exactly where to look. The knock on the office door came 30 seconds later, followed by the authoritative voice of Senior Aura Kingsley Shacklebolt. "Arthur Weasley, we need to speak with you regarding a security incident in the Department of Mysteries." Andromeda quickly cast a Notice Me Not charm on herself and slipped into the space behind Arthur's desk as he opened the door. "Kingsley," Arthur said with admirable calm, "what can I do for you?" "We have reason to believe someone accessed classified files without authorization," Kingsley said, his deep voice carrying the weight of official investigation. "Your ministry badge was detected in the lower levels during a time when you had no legitimate business there." "I was investigating a report of a potentially dangerous magical artifact in the storage areas," Arthur replied smoothly. "A music box that plays itself and causes listeners to speak only the truth. Rather embarrassing, actually. I was hoping to retrieve it before anyone noticed it was missing." Kingsley's expression remained professionally neutral, but Andromeda caught the flicker of something, amusement, respect, in his eyes. "I see. And did you find this music box?" "Unfortunately, no. It must have been moved to a different storage area. I was planning to file a proper search request tomorrow." "I'm sure you were," Kingsley said dryly. "Arthur, I need you to understand that the files accessed today contained information of national security importance. If someone is conducting an unauthorized investigation, then perhaps," Arthur said carefully, "the question isn't who accessed the files, but why such files exist in the first place." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Andromeda realized that some form of communication was passing between them that went beyond words. Kingsley was an honorable man, she knew, someone who had served alongside Order of the Phoenix members during the last war. If Arthur could make him understand what they had discovered. "I can give you 12 hours, Kingsley said finally. 12 hours before I have to report that the investigation is ongoing. What you do with that time is your business. But after that, all official procedures take over." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Arthur, be careful. There are forces at work here that go far beyond what you might expect. Not everyone in the ministry can be trusted." When the door closed behind him, Andromeda dropped her concealment charm and found herself face to face with Arthur's grim expression. 12 hours, Arthur said. "That's not much time to prepare a defense against charges of treason." "It's enough time to ensure this evidence reaches people who can use it," Andromeda replied. "Kingsley just gave us the most valuable gift possible. Time to act before they can cover this up completely." As they spoke, neither of them noticed the small silver device in Arthur's wastebasket, a device that had been recording their entire conversation, placed there by someone who had anticipated exactly this sequence of events. 3 floors above, in the minister's office, Cornelius Fudge listened to the recording with growing alarm. When it ended, he immediately activated his private flu connection. "Albus," he said to the flames, "we have a problem. They've found the files." The voice that answered carried a weariness that spoke of long years and difficult choices. "Then it's time to begin damage control, Cornelius. Some secrets are too important to remain buried, but others must be protected at all costs. What do you want me to do? Arrest Andromeda Tonks, charge her with treason and espionage, confiscate all materials related to her investigation, and Arthur Weasley. Arthur is a more delicate matter. He has connections, the allies who would ask inconvenient questions. For now, simply monitor him. But the woman must be silenced before she can present her evidence." Fudge nodded, though Dumbledore couldn't see him through the flu connection. "It will be done." As the connection closed, Fudge felt the familiar weight of choices that would haunt him later. But Dumbledore was right. Some secrets were too dangerous to reveal. The stability of their entire world depended on maintaining certain illusions, even if those illusions were built on the suffering of children. In Arthur's office, Andromeda was carefully organizing the copied documents when a house elf appeared with a soft pop. "Miss Andromeda Tonks," the elf said urgently. "Winky sends a message. The auras are coming for you. You must leave. Now." Andromeda looked at Arthur, who nodded grimly. "I'll take the documents and go," he said. "I'll delay them as long as I can." As Andromeda gathered her materials and prepared to flee, she felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. The game had changed. This was no longer about justice or legal procedure. This was about survival. And somewhere in the maze of ministry politics and hidden agendas, a 15-year-old boy continued to live under the shadow of plans he knew nothing about, plans that would demand everything from him and give nothing in return. But now, at least, someone was fighting for him. Someone who refused to let his sacrifice go unquestioned. Chapter 5. The hearing begins. The Wizengamot courtroom had witnessed many historic moments in its centuries of existence. Trials of dark wizards, debates that shaped magical law, testimonies that toppled governments. But never before had it hosted a house elf as a witness. The ancient chamber, with its tiered stone benches and soaring Gothic arches, seemed to hold its breath as Winky made her way to the witness chair in the center of the courtroom floor. Every seat in the public gallery was filled, and those who couldn't find space pressed against the walls or craned their necks from the doorways. Representatives from the Daily Prophet sat with quills poised, while sketch artists worked frantically to capture the unprecedented scene. The international magical press had sent correspondence, word having spread through diplomatic channels that something extraordinary was unfolding in the British magical government. Andromeda Tonks stood at the advocate's table, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. She had survived the previous week's persecution, the arrest warrant that had been mysteriously withdrawn after public outcry, the anonymous threats, the attempts to have her disbarred from magical law practice. The evidence Arthur had helped her secure was now formally entered into the Wizengamot record, protected by legal safeguards that made it impossible to suppress or destroy. Across the courtroom, Albus Dumbledore sat in the defendant's section, flanked by a team of the Ministry's most expensive legal counsel. He appeared as serene as ever, his blue eyes twinkling behind half-moon spectacles. But Andromeda had learned to read the subtle tensions in powerful men's faces, the slight tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed against his robes. These were signs of a man who had not expected to find himself in this position. Now Minister Fudge presided over the proceedings from the Chief Warlock's seat, his face a mask of official neutrality that fooled no one who understood the political implications. This trial threatened to tear apart the very foundations of trust that held magical Britain together. If the public came to believe that their most revered leader had deliberately orchestrated a child's suffering, the consequences would reverberate through every aspect of their society. But it was Winky herself who commanded the attention of everyone present. She sat in the witness chair with a dignity that surprised those who had only known house elves as servile creatures, her large eyes reflecting the magical torches that lit the chamber. She wore a simple but clean dress, not the tea-towel rags that marked her dismissed status, but proper clothing that Andromeda had insisted upon. Today, Winky would speak not as a discarded servant, but as a being with inherent worth and the right to be heard. The court clerk's voice echoed through the chamber. The Wizengamot recognizes Winky, formerly of the Crouch household, appearing as primary witness in the matter of alleged conspiracy to endanger a minor. A ripple of whispered conversation swept through the gallery. Many of those present had never seen a house elf speak, except to confirm orders or beg forgiveness for imagined failures. The idea that one might possess information worthy of the Wizengamot's attention was revolutionary in itself. Andromeda rose from her seat, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Members of the Wizengamot, my client appears before you today, not as a servant, but as a magical being whose testimony is protected under the Magical Beings Protection Act of 1631. Her bond to the Crouch family, rather than compromising her reliability, actually ensures the absolute truth of her statements regarding her former masters. She gestured toward the evidence table, where the copied documents from the Department of Mysteries sat in neat stacks, each page marked with the official seals that made them admissible in court. The testimony you will hear today is supported by extensive documentary evidence, correspondence that spans nearly 15 years, and details a conspiracy of unprecedented scope and cruelty. Dumbledore's lead counsel, a sharp-faced wizard named Torquil Travers, stood immediately. Objection, Chief Warlock. The prosecution seeks to present testimony from a creature whose loyalty was purchased through magical compulsion. How can this court trust the word of a being who was magically bound to serve? The objection struck at the heart of wizarding prejudice, the assumption that house elves were incapable of independent thought or moral reasoning. Andromeda had expected this challenge and prepared accordingly. The learned counsel misunderstands the nature of house elf magic, she replied calmly. The bond between house elf and family does not compel loyalty, it compels truth. My client cannot lie about what she has witnessed regarding her master's words and actions. That same magical bond that the defense seeks to use as disqualification actually provides the strongest possible guarantee of her honesty. She pulled out a thick legal tome, its pages marked with strips of parchment. Magical Jurisprudence and Creature Testimony. Chapter 7. The house elf bond, being magical in nature, creates an absolute compulsion toward truth when discussing family matters. No house elf has ever been recorded as giving false testimony regarding their master's actions. This precedent has been upheld in magical courts for 6 centuries. Chief Warlock Fudge looked distinctly uncomfortable as he consulted with the legal advisors flanking his chair. The murmur of conversation in the gallery grew louder. Many of those present were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple trial. "The objection is overruled," Fudge announced reluctantly. "The witness may proceed with her testimony." Andromeda turned to Winky, her expression gentle but encouraging. "Please tell the court your name and your relationship to the Crouch family." Winky's voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. The magical acoustics of the courtroom carried her words to every corner of the chamber, and the absolute silence that greeted her testimony spoke to the historic nature of the moment. "Winky was house elf to Master Barty Crouch Sr. for 37 years, she said. "Winky's mother served before her, and Winky's grandmother before that. For 12 years, Winky also cared for Master Barty Crouch Jr., keeping him safe and secret as Master Crouch Sr. commanded. And during your service to the Crouch family, did you have occasion to witness meetings between Barty Crouch Sr. and Professor Albus Dumbledore?" "Yes," Winky replied. "Many meetings. Your Master Crouch spoke often with Professor Dumbledore about Harry Potter. Winky was present when they planned." The word "planned" fell into the courtroom like a stone into still water, creating ripples of reaction that spread throughout the gallery. Reporters scribbled frantically, while sketch artists captured Winky's earnest expression and the varying reactions of the Wizengamot members. "Can you describe one of these meetings for the court?" Andromeda asked. Winky closed her eyes, her face taking on the distant expression that house elves wore when accessing their perfect magical memory. 3 months before the Triwizard Tournament began, Professor Dumbledore came to Master Crouch's study. Winky was polishing the silver service. Or they spoke as if Winky was not there. Wizards always speak freely around house elves. She opened her eyes, meeting the gaze of several Wizengamot members who were leaning forward in their seats. Professor Dumbledore said the tournament would provide the perfect opportunity to test Harry Potter's willingness to sacrifice himself. He said the boy's upbringing had been carefully managed to ensure his psychological readiness for martyrdom. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Several Wizengamot members looked shocked, while others appeared skeptical. But Winky continued with the relentless precision that characterized house elf testimony. Master Crouch asked if the boy might break under the pressure. Professor Dumbledore said the boy's suffering would make him more willing to sacrifice himself when the time came, and he said, "Your plan requires the boy to suffer, Barty. We must not allow sentiment to interfere with necessity." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Andromeda watched as the implications sank in, not just among the gallery and press, but among the Wizengamot members themselves. These were not vague allegations or hearsay, but specific quotes delivered with the perfect accuracy that house elf bonds guaranteed. Dumbledore's counsel was on his feet immediately. "Objection. This testimony describes conversations that allegedly occurred in private. How can the court verify?" "The court can verify through the documentary evidence already submitted," Andromeda interrupted smoothly. "Letters in Professor Dumbledore's own handwriting that confirm every detail of my client's testimony." She held up one of the copied letters, that its official ministry authentication, seals clearly visible. Correspondence dated just days after the meeting my client described, in which Professor Dumbledore writes to Barty Crouch Sr., "The boy's conditioning proceeds as discussed. His isolation and repeated trauma have produced the psychological profile we require." The letter was passed to the Chief Warlock for examination, and Fudge's face grew increasingly pale as he read its contents. When he looked up, his expression was that of a man who realized that the political earthquake he had been trying to prevent was now inevitable. "The court recognizes the authenticity of this correspondence," he announced reluctantly. Winky continued her testimony for another hour, describing meeting after meeting, plan after plan, the careful orchestration of a child's entire life. She spoke of monitoring reports on Harry's treatment at the Dursleys, of deliberate decisions to ignore evidence of abuse, of discussions about which challenges at Hogwarts would best serve to prepare him for eventual sacrifice. With each revelation, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew more charged. The public gallery, initially filled with curiosity seekers and sensation hunters, had transformed into something more serious, witnesses to a moment when the foundations of their society were being examined and found wanting. When Andromeda announced that she was finished with her direct examination, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Everyone present understood that they had just heard testimony that would reshape the wizarding world's understanding of recent events. It was Dumbledore's counsel who broke the silence, as rising to begin his cross-examination with the air of a man preparing to battle for his client's life and reputation. "Miss Winky," Travers began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You claim to remember these conversations with perfect accuracy, despite the fact that they occurred months or even years ago." "House elves remember everything about their families," Winky replied simply. "It is what we are." "But surely your affection for the Crouch family might color your interpretation of what you heard, might make you eager to please those who now offer you attention and importance." It was a clever attack, questioning not Winky's honesty, but her interpretation of events. But Andromeda had prepared for this line of attack as well. "Objection," she called out. Your counsel is asking the witness to speculate about her own motivations, rather than addressing the factual content of her testimony. "Sustained," Fudge ruled, though his reluctance was obvious. Travers tried a different approach. "You claim that Professor Dumbledore used the phrase, 'the boy's suffering would make him more willing to sacrifice himself.' Are you certain those were his exact words?" "Yes," Winky said without hesitation. "House elves cannot misremember their master's words. It is impossible for us." "But Professor Dumbledore was not your master. How can you be certain?" "Professor Dumbledore was speaking about Master Crouch's plans," Winky interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "Winky's bond to Master Crouch ensures perfect memory of all conversations concerning the Crouch family's business. But this was the Crouch family's business." The legal precision of her answer clearly frustrated Travers, who had been hoping to find a loophole in the magical compulsion that guaranteed house elf testimony. But Winky's understanding of her own magical nature was as precise as her memory. For another hour, Travers attempted to discredit Winky's testimony, attacking her from every angle he could devise. He questioned her mental state following her dismissal, suggested that her drinking problem might have affected her memory, even implied that she might be lying to gain revenge against her former master. But with each attack, Winky's responses grew more dignified, more certain. The magical bond that Travers sought to use against her actually provided her with an unassailable defense. She literally could not lie about what she had witnessed. But more importantly, the courtroom audience was beginning to see Winky not as a creature seeking attention or revenge, but as a being of conscience who had risked everything to speak truth to power. Her quiet dignity, in the face of aggressive questioning, was winning converts among both the gallery and the Wizengamot members. When the cross-examination finally ended, Chief Warlock Fudge called for a recess to allow the court to consider what they had heard. As the courtroom slowly emptied, conversations buzzed with speculation and disbelief. But in the witness area, Winky sat quietly, her large eyes reflecting a sense of completion. She had done what she came to do. She had spoken the truth, regardless of the consequences. Andromeda approached her client with something approaching awe. "Winky, you were magnificent. You may have just changed the course of wizarding history." Winky looked up at her advocate, then toward the empty defendant's table where Dumbledore had been sitting just moments before. "Winky did not speak to change history," she said softly. "Winky spoke because children should not be sacrificed for the greater good, not even for wars." As the courtroom continued to empty, neither Winky nor Andromeda noticed the small group of reporters who had remained behind, their quick quotes quills already drafting headlines that would reshape public opinion before the sun set. The trial was far from over, but the battle for the truth had already begun. And for the first time in decades, it was a house elf who was leading the charge. Chapter 6. Dumbledore's Defense. When the Wizengamot reconvened after its recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted palpably. Word of Winky's testimony had spread through the ministry's corridors like wildfire, and the public gallery now held a different quality of observer. Senior ministry officials who had abandoned their duties to witness history, members of the International Confederation of Wizards who had arrived via emergency portkey, and journalists whose quick quotes quills had already filed preliminary reports that were reshaping public opinion across magical Britain. Albus Dumbledore rose from the defendant's table with the measured dignity that had characterized his public presence for decades. As he walked to the witness stand, every eye in the courtroom followed him. This legendary figure who had defeated Grindelwald, who had led the resistance against Voldemort, who had been the moral compass of the wizarding world for longer than most people could remember. Even his accusers could not deny the weight of his presence, the accumulated authority of a life spent in service to the light. He settled into the witness chair with the ease of someone who had testified before this body many times, who had shaped policy and guided decisions from this very spot. When he spoke, his voice carried the warm authority that had comforted a generation of witches and wizards through their darkest hours. "Members of the Wizengamot," he began, his blue eyes twinkling as they surveyed the tiered benches, "I appear before you today, not to deny the basic facts presented by the previous witness, but to provide the context that transforms those facts from accusations into necessary, if regrettable, actions taken in defense of our entire world." The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. By acknowledging the truth of Winky's testimony while reframing its meaning, Dumbledore had executed a masterful legal maneuver that forced the focus away from whether the conversations had occurred and toward whether they had been justified. "Yes," he continued, his tone carrying the gravity of profound moral responsibility. "I coordinated with Barty Crouch Sr. regarding Harry Potter's upbringing and education. Yes, we made difficult choices about his living situation and the challenges he would face. But these decisions were not made lightly, nor were they made without the most compelling justification imaginable." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. When he resumed speaking, his voice carried a note of reluctance, as if he were revealing secrets that he had hoped never to share. "There exists a prophecy," he said simply, "made 16 years ago by Sybil Trelawney, witnessed by myself, and, unfortunately, partially overheard by a Death Eater spy. This prophecy speaks of a child born at the end of July, born to parents who had thrice defied the Dark Lord, marked by Voldemort himself as his equal. It states that neither can live while the other survives, that one must die at the hand of the other." The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. Many in the courtroom had heard rumors of a prophecy, whispered speculation about why Voldemort had targeted the Potter family specifically. But to hear it confirmed by Dumbledore himself was to confront a reality that transformed everything they thought they knew about the war. "Harry Potter," Dumbledore continued, "is not simply a symbol of hope or a convenient rallying point for our cause. He is, according to magical prophecy, the only person capable of defeating Voldemort permanently. This is not a burden we chose for him. It is a burden that fate, magic itself, placed upon his shoulders before he was even born." Andromeda rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the spell of Dumbledore's words. "Professor Dumbledore, does this prophecy require that Harry Potter be psychologically manipulated? Does it mandate years of deliberate trauma and isolation?" Dumbledore's expression grew somber, the twinkling in his eyes dimming as he considered his response. "Miss Tonks, the prophecy tells us what must happen, not how it must happen. The choices we made regarding Harry's upbringing were informed by a terrible understanding of what would be required of him." He turned to address the Wizengamot directly, his voice taking on the persuasive cadence that had swayed countless debates and decisions. Consider the magnitude of what we were asking. We needed a young man who would be willing to face the most dangerous dark wizard in history, knowing that the encounter would likely result in his death. We needed someone who valued the lives of others more than his own life, who had learned through hard experience that sacrifice was sometimes necessary for the greater good. So you deliberately traumatized him, Andromeda pressed. You ensured he would grow up believing himself worthless, to believing that his only value lay in his willingness to die for others. I ensured, Dumbledore replied with quiet firmness, that when the moment came for him to choose between his own survival and the survival of our entire world, he would make the choice that would save everyone else. Yes, this required allowing him to experience hardship. Yes, it meant denying him some of the comfort and security that every child deserves. But the alternative was the eternal enslavement of the wizarding world under Voldemort's rule. The moral complexity of his argument was undeniable, and Andromeda could see its effect on the Wizengamot members. These were people who had lived through Voldemort's reign of terror, who had seen friends and family members tortured and killed, who understood viscerally the stakes of the war. The idea that one child's suffering might prevent the suffering of thousands was not an easy proposition to dismiss. But Dumbledore was not finished. He rose from his chair, his tall frame commanding attention, as he began to pace before the witness stand. "Let me be clear about what we faced," he said, his voice rising with passion. "When Voldemort fell in 1981, we knew it was temporary. The magic that protected Harry from the killing curse was profound, but limited. We knew that Voldemort would return, and when he did, only Harry would be capable of defeating him permanently." He stopped pacing, fixing his gaze on the chief warlock. In those circumstances, what was the moral choice? To allow Harry to grow up sheltered and unprepared, to coddle him with affection that would make him hesitant to sacrifice himself when necessary, or to prepare him, through carefully managed adversity, for the role that destiny had chosen for him. The questions hung in the air like a challenge, and Andromeda could feel the mood in the courtroom shifting. Dumbledore's defense was not denial. It was a full-throated justification of utilitarian ethics that forced everyone present to confront the terrible mathematics of war. "Furthermore," Dumbledore continued, "every decision we made was reversible, every hardship temporary. Harry was never in genuine mortal danger during his childhood. We monitored his situation constantly and would have intervened if his life had been truly at risk. The Dursley family was chosen precisely because they would neglect him without actively endangering him. As every challenge he faced at Hogwarts was carefully calibrated to test his courage and resolve without exceeding his capabilities. The defense was masterful in its acknowledgement of the basic facts while recontextualizing them completely. Dumbledore was not denying the manipulation. He was arguing that it had been necessary, justified, and ultimately successful. Chief Warlock Fudge cleared his throat nervously. "Professor Dumbledore, how do you respond to the allegation that you deliberately ignored reports of abuse from the Dursley household?" "I respond," Dumbledore said with evident sadness, "that we lived in a state of constant moral compromise. Yes, Harry's relatives treated him poorly. Yes, we could have removed him to a more comfortable situation. But doing so would have broken the blood protection that kept him safe from Voldemort's agents, and it would have deprived him of the character-building adversity that prepared him for his ultimate confrontation." He paused, his expression growing more grave. "I take no pleasure in these choices, Chief Warlock. They have weighed on my conscience for 15 years, but I would make them again, because the alternative was the end of everything we hold dear." It was then that Dumbledore's legal team called their first character witness. Minerva McGonagall took the stand with the stern dignity that had characterized her decades at Hogwarts, her expression reflecting the internal conflict of someone forced to choose between personal misgivings and institutional loyalty. "Professor McGonagall," Travers began, "you have worked closely with Professor Dumbledore for how many years?" 37 years, McGonagall replied crisply. And in your professional opinion, is Professor Dumbledore someone who would deliberately harm a child? McGonagall's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Andromeda caught it. Albus Dumbledore is a man who has devoted his life to protecting the wizarding world, she said carefully. Every decision he has made has been motivated by that commitment. That wasn't what I asked, Travers pressed. Would he deliberately harm a child? Professor Dumbledore understands, McGonagall said slowly, that sometimes individual sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. He would never cause harm without the most compelling justification. It was a politically astute answer that managed to support Dumbledore without directly contradicting the evidence that had been presented. But Andromeda noted the careful phrasing. The reluctance that suggested McGonagall's support was more institutional than personal. Severus Snape's testimony was more straightforward, though no less complex in its implications. He took the stand with the cold precision that characterized his public persona, his black eyes scanning the courtroom with obvious disdain. Professor Snape, Travers continued, you were a Death Eater during the First War against Voldemort. What caused you to change your allegiance? I became disillusioned with the Dark Lord's methods, Snape replied in his characteristic monotone. Professor Dumbledore offered me redemption in exchange for service to the light. And has Professor Dumbledore ever asked you to do anything that you believed was morally wrong? Snape's pause was longer than McGonagall's had been, and when he spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested they came from hard experience. Professor Dumbledore has asked me to do many things that were morally complex, but he has never asked me to act without purpose, and he has never asked me to sacrifice others without first being willing to sacrifice himself. The testimony continued for hours, with character witness after character witness testifying to Dumbledore's dedication, his wisdom, his willingness to make difficult choices for the greater good. But as each witness spoke, Andromeda noticed the careful qualifications in their support, of the reluctance to offer unconditional endorsement of his methods. When the character testimony concluded, Dumbledore's legal team turned their attention back to Winky, launching a renewed assault on her credibility that was far more vicious than their initial cross-examination. Miss Winky, Travers began, his tone dripping with contempt. You claim to have perfect memory of these conversations. But is it not true that you have suffered from severe depression and alcohol dependency since your dismissal? Winky's voice was steady when she replied. Winky drinks to forget her shame, not to forget her duties. House elf magic does not allow us to forget our master's words. But your emotional state could affect your interpretation of what you heard, could it not? Your anger at being dismissed, nor your resentment toward the family that discarded you. Winky does not interpret, she said simply. Winky remembers. House elves do not have the luxury of changing masters' words to suit their feelings. Travers switched tactics, attacking her motivations rather than her memory. Isn't it true that you approached Miss Granger specifically because you knew she was sympathetic to house elf causes? That you manipulated her advocacy to gain attention and importance for yourself? For the first time since taking the stand, Winky's composure wavered. Winky approached Miss Granger because Miss Granger listens to those who have no voice. Winky did not want attention. Winky wanted justice for Harry Potter. Justice, Travers repeated sarcastically. Or revenge against the family that found you inadequate. Objection, Andromeda called out. Counsel is attacking the witness rather than addressing her testimony. But the damage was being done. Andromeda could see doubt creeping into some of the Wizengamot members' expressions, the suggestion that Winky's motivations might be personal rather than principled. The cross-examination continued for another brutal hour, with Travers systematically attacking every aspect of Winky's character and credibility. He painted her as a dismissed servant seeking revenge, an alcoholic whose judgment was compromised, a creature whose magical nature made her incapable of understanding the complex moral decisions that wizards faced. When it finally ended, Winky sat in the witness chair looking smaller than she had when the day began, the weight of the attacks having visibly taken their toll. Chief Warlock Fudge called for another recess, and as the courtroom emptied, the conversations in the corridors were markedly different from those that had followed Winky's initial testimony. Dumbledore's defense had been effective, not in denying the facts, but in providing a moral framework that transformed those facts from evidence of criminal conspiracy into evidence of tragic necessity. As the participants filed out of the courtroom, it was clear that the Wizengamot was genuinely divided. Some members looked convinced by Dumbledore's utilitarian arguments, while others appeared horrified by the implications of his defense. The battle for public opinion was far from over, and the outcome remained uncertain. But in the witness area, Winky sat quietly, her large eyes reflecting not defeat but a kind of peaceful resignation. She had spoken her truth, withstood their attacks, and remained faithful to her purpose. Whatever the outcome of the trial, she had done what she came to do. The truth was now in the hands of the wizarding world. And sometimes, that had to be enough. Chapter 7. Harry's Testimony. The corridors outside the Wizengamot courtroom buzzed with a tension that was part anticipation, part disbelief. Word had spread through the ministry with lightning speed. Harry Potter himself was demanding to testify. The boy who lived, the subject of the conspiracy allegations, was refusing to remain silent while others debated his fate. Hermione Granger stood beside Harry in the witness preparation room, her face etched with concern that bordered on desperation. "Harry, you don't have to do this," she said, for the third time in as many minutes. "Winky's testimony is strong enough. The evidence speaks for itself." "Does it?" Harry asked, his green eyes reflecting a weariness that seemed far too old for his 15 years. "Because from what I heard, Dumbledore's managed to turn child abuse into noble sacrifice. He's made it sound like everything that happened to me was justified, necessary, even admirable." Ron Weasley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his freckled face pale with worry. "Mate, you don't know what it's like in there. The questions they'll ask, the way they'll try to twist your words." "They can't twist the truth, Ron," Harry said quietly. "And the truth is that I was never asked. Not once, in all these years, did anyone ask me if I was willing to be their weapon. They just assumed I'd be grateful for the privilege of dying for them." Andromeda Tonks, who had been silently reviewing her notes, looked up with the expression of a lawyer who knew she was about to lose control of her case. "Harry, I understand your desire to speak, but testimony from the alleged victim could complicate our legal strategy. Dumbledore's defense team will—" "Will what?" Harry interrupted, rising from his chair with sudden intensity. "Try to discredit me? Paint me as an ungrateful child who doesn't understand the sacrifices made on his behalf? They can try, but I'm the only person in that courtroom who actually lived through what they're debating." He moved to the small window that overlooked the ministry's atrium, watching the crowds of witches and wizards who had gathered to witness the historic proceedings. "I've spent 4 years at Hogwarts, watching Dumbledore orchestrate my life like I was a chess piece. First year, he made sure I'd face Quirrell alone. Second year, he let me walk into the Chamber of Secrets without backup. Third year, he allowed Sirius to remain a fugitive for months when he could have cleared his name with a simple truth serum. Fourth year—" His voice broke slightly, and when he continued, the words carried the weight of recent trauma. "Fourth year, he let me be entered into a tournament that was designed to kill me. And when Cedric died because I insisted we take the cup together, Dumbledore's first concern wasn't grief or justice. It was making sure I understood that this was just the beginning." Hermione moved to stand beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Harry, everyone in that courtroom knows what you've been through. You don't have to relive it to prove—" "To prove what?" Harry turned to face her, and she was startled by the fierce determination in his expression. "That I'm a victim? That I deserve sympathy? I don't want sympathy, Hermione. I want the right to choose my own life." 20 minutes later, Harry Potter walked into the Wizengamot courtroom and the assembled crowd fell silent. He had testified before this body once before, but that had been a disciplinary hearing about underage magic, a footnote in ministry bureaucracy. This was different. This was the boy who lived speaking about his own manipulation, his own exploitation, in front of the people who claimed to lead magical Britain. He settled into the witness chair with a composure that surprised even his supporters. At 15, Harry had faced dragons and dark wizards, had duelled with Voldemort himself, and lived to tell about it. A room full of bureaucrats, however intimidating their titles, held no terrors for someone who had looked death in the eye and found it wanting. Chief Warlock Fudge cleared his throat nervously. The political implications of Harry's testimony were staggering. If the boy who lived himself condemned the actions taken in his name, it would be nearly impossible for the Wizengamot to dismiss the charges, regardless of Dumbledore's legendary status. "Mr. Potter," Fudge began carefully, "you understand that your testimony here today is voluntary? That no one is compelling you to speak?" "Yes, sir," Harry replied, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "I'm here because for the first time in my life, someone is asking me what I want instead of deciding what's best for me." The simple statement carried an emotional weight that resonated throughout the courtroom. Here was the hero of the wizarding world, the child who had saved them all, saying that no one had ever bothered to ask his opinion about his own life. Andromeda rose from the prosecution table, her expression mixing reluctance with admiration. "Mr. Potter, can you tell the court about your living situation before attending Hogwarts?" Harry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I lived with my aunt and uncle, the Dursleys, from the time I was 15 months old until I started Hogwarts. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They made it clear that I was unwanted. I slept in a cupboard under the stairs until I was 11, and I was given Dudley's cast-off clothes and minimal food. When I showed signs of magic, they locked me in my room for days at a time." "And did you ever try to seek help?" "When I was 9, I wrote a letter to someone called Dumbledore," Harry said, his voice growing quieter. "I'd heard Aunt Petunia mention him once, and I thought maybe he could help me find somewhere else to live. I gave the letter to the postman, but it never reached anyone. Later, I learned that mail to magical families is intercepted by the Ministry for Monitoring. Did you write any other letters seeking help?" "Several," Harry confirmed. "To Hogwarts, to the Ministry, even to what I thought might be wizard orphanages. None of them were ever answered. None of them even reached their destinations." Andromeda consulted her notes. "Mr. Potter, when you arrived at Hogwarts, did Professor Dumbledore ever discuss your living situation with you?" "He told me that I was protected by my mother's sacrifice," Harry said, "that her blood magic kept me safe as long as I could call Privet Drive home. He said the Dursleys' treatment of me was regrettable but necessary." He looked directly at Dumbledore, who sat motionless at the defendant's table. "He never asked if I agreed with that assessment." "And during your time at Hogwarts, did you ever feel that Professor Dumbledore was guiding you toward particular courses of action?" Harry's laugh was short and bitter. "Guiding is a gentle word for it. Every year, I found myself in situations that seemed designed to test whether I was willing to risk my life for others. The Philosopher's Stone, the Chamber of Secrets, or the Triwizard Tournament. Looking back, it's obvious that I was being prepared for something." "Prepared for what?" "To die," Harry said simply, and the words fell into the courtroom like stones. "To face Voldemort knowing that I probably wouldn't survive, and to be okay with that. To think of myself as expendable." The silence that followed was profound. Even Dumbledore's supporters among the Wizengamot members looked shaken by the flat certainty in Harry's voice. "Mr. Potter," Andromeda continued gently, "can you tell the court about the night Cedric Diggory died?" Harry's composure finally cracked, his hands clenching into fists as he struggled to maintain his emotional control. "Cedric was murdered because of me," he said, his voice thick with guilt and grief. The tournament was rigged to ensure I'd reach that graveyard. And Barty Crouch Jr., pretending to be Mad-Eye Moody, made sure I'd win, made sure I'd take the portkey. Cedric was only there because I insisted we take the cup together. And after you returned with Cedric's body, what did Professor Dumbledore tell you? He told me that Voldemort had returned, Harry said, his voice growing stronger with anger. He told me that this was what he'd been preparing me for. He said that now the real war could begin, and that I would need to be ready for whatever came next. He looked up at the Wizengamot members, his green eyes blazing. He never once said he was sorry that Cedric had to die for his plans. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps, but Harry continued speaking, his voice rising above the noise. "I want everyone in this room to understand something," he said, standing up from the witness chair despite the proper protocol. I never chose to be the boy who lived. I never asked to be a symbol or a weapon or a sacrifice. But I'm choosing now. Chief Warlock Fudge banged his gavel for order, but Harry ignored the interruption. "I'm choosing to reject the role you've all written for me," Harry declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "I refuse to be anyone's martyred savior. I refuse to die quietly for the greater good. And I refuse to let anyone else decide what my life is worth." The impact of his words was immediate and electric. The public gallery buzzed with excitement, while several Wizengamot members looked as though they'd been struck by lightning. This was not the humble, self-sacrificing hero they'd expected. This was a young man claiming ownership of his own destiny. Dumbledore's lead counsel, Travers, rose quickly to begin his cross-examination, clearly hoping to regain control of the narrative. "Mr. Potter, you speak as though Professor Dumbledore forced you into dangerous situations. But isn't it true that you chose to face these challenges? That you could have walked away at any time?" Harry's smile was sharp and knowing. "Could I? When I was 11 and told that someone was trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone, was I really free to ignore it? When I was 12 and Ginny Weasley was dying in the Chamber of Secrets, did I have a choice about whether to save her? When I was 14 and forced into the Triwizard Tournament, could I have simply refused to compete? You could have sought help." "From whom?" Harry interrupted. "From the professors who answered to Dumbledore? Or from the ministry that considered me a celebrity rather than a person? From the magical world that saw me as either a saint or a fraud, but never as a child who needed protection?" Travers tried a different approach. "Mr. Potter, surely you recognize that your unique circumstances, your survival of the killing curse, your connection to Voldemort, made you naturally important in the fight against dark magic." "My circumstances," Harry said with deliberate precision, "made me a victim of dark magic. Everything else, the hero worship, the expectations, the manipulation, those were choices made by adults who decided that my trauma could be useful to them." "But don't you feel any responsibility to use your abilities to help others?" The question hung in the air, and Harry considered it carefully before responding. When he spoke, his voice was quieter but no less determined. "I feel responsible for the choices I make freely," he said, "not for the ones that were made for me before I was old enough to understand them. If I choose to fight Voldemort, it will be because I've decided he needs to be stopped, not because a prophecy or a headmaster told me it was my destiny." He looked directly at Dumbledore again, and this time the old wizard met his gaze. "I spent 4 years thinking I owed you my life because you saved me from Voldemort as a baby. Now I learn that you only saved me so you could sacrifice me later. The debt I thought I owed you, I don't owe you anything." The cross-examination continued for another hour, but Travers was clearly struggling against Harry's combination of moral clarity and personal experience. Every attempt to paint him as ungrateful or naive was met with specific examples of manipulation and exploitation. Every effort to invoke his responsibility to others was countered with questions about who was responsible for his well-being. When the questioning finally ended, Harry remained standing in the witness area, his green eyes surveying the courtroom with something approaching defiance. "I have one more thing to say," he announced, ignoring the procedural protests from both legal teams. "To everyone in this room who thinks Dumbledore's methods were justified because they were fighting Voldemort, you're wrong. Fighting evil doesn't justify becoming evil. Protecting children doesn't justify abusing them. And saving the world doesn't justify sacrificing the people you claim to be saving." He paused, his voice dropping but somehow becoming more powerful. "Cedric Diggory died because adults decided that my suffering was more important than his safety. How many other Cedrics will die because you're too afraid to question the people who claim to know what's best for everyone?" With that, Harry Potter walked out of the witness area, leaving behind a courtroom full of people who were beginning to understand that their war hero was also a war victim, and that he refused to be either one anymore. The silence that followed his departure was the silence of a world shifting on its axis. The boy they had placed on a pedestal had climbed down, and nothing would ever be the same. In the public gallery, a young witch named Luna Lovegood turned to her father and said quietly, "I think Harry Potter just declared independence from the wizarding world." She was not wrong. As word of Harry's testimony spread beyond the courtroom, carried by the reporters and spectators who had witnessed it, a new conversation began to emerge in magical Britain. For the first time, people were asking not what Harry Potter owed them, but what they owed Harry Potter. And the answer to that question would reshape everything they thought they knew about heroes, sacrifice, and the true cost of their freedom. The boy who had lived was finally learning how to live for himself, and the wizarding world would have to decide whether they were brave enough to let him. Chapter 8. The Crouch Senior Connection. The aftermath of Harry Potter's testimony had left the Wizengamot courtroom in a state of barely controlled chaos. The reporters frantically scribbled notes, while spectators engaged in heated debates about the moral implications of what they had witnessed. But Andromeda Tonks sat at the prosecution table with the focused calm of a predator that had scented blood. Harry's powerful words had shifted public opinion, but she still needed to prove the full extent of the conspiracy, and that meant exposing the man who had made it all possible. Barty Crouch Sr. sat in the defendant's section with the rigid posture that had characterized his entire career, but Andromeda could see the signs of strain that no amount of ministerial dignity could fully conceal. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the exits, the careful stillness that suggested a man preparing to run, these were the tells of someone who knew his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "Members of the Wizengamot," Andromeda began as the court reconvened, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. "We have heard from the victim of this conspiracy and from one of its architects. Now it is time to examine the mechanisms by which this conspiracy was implemented, the deliberate manipulation of ministry policy and procedure that made Harry Potter's exploitation possible." She gestured toward the evidence table, where new documents had been added to the already substantial collection. "These are internal ministry memoranda, policy directives, and security protocols spanning the past 15 years. They tell the story of how Barty Crouch Sr., acting under Professor Dumbledore's guidance, systematically weakened the very protections that should have safeguarded magical Britain's children. The first document she presented was a ministry directive from 1983, bearing Crouch Sr.'s official seal and signature. A policy memorandum establishing new guidelines for investigating reports of child abuse in magical households. The key provision: reports concerning the Potter household are to be referred directly to the department head for personal review and are not to be investigated by standard child welfare protocols. A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the courtroom. The implication was clear. Crouch Sr. had created an official policy specifically designed to prevent intervention in Harry's situation. "The next document," Andromeda continued, holding up another memorandum, dated 1987, a directive to Aura Command regarding security protocols for monitoring known Death Eater associates. Note the explicit exemption for the Dursley family of Privet Drive, Little Whinging, despite their guardianship of the most high-value target in magical Britain. Chief Warlock Fudge leaned forward in his chair, his face pale with the growing realization of what was being revealed. Miss Tonks, are you suggesting that Mr. Crouch deliberately compromised Ministry security? I'm not suggesting anything, Chief Warlock. I'm presenting documented evidence that Barty Crouch Sr. consistently implemented policies that served Professor Dumbledore's agenda rather than the Ministry's mandate to protect its citizens. She pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. A standing order from 1989 requiring all reports of accidental magic from the Potter household to be suppressed rather than investigated. The reasoning given: national security concerns. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Document after document revealed a systematic effort to isolate Harry Potter from any form of official oversight or protection. Every policy had been crafted to ensure that his suffering would continue uninterrupted, that no well-meaning ministry official would accidentally interfere with Dumbledore's grand design. But it was the testimony of Percy Weasley that truly illuminated the human cost of these bureaucratic machinations. Percy took the witness stand with obvious reluctance, his usually immaculate appearance marred by sleepless nights and the stress of choosing between institutional loyalty and moral conscience. As Crouch Sr.'s personal assistant, he had been closer to the conspiracy than anyone except its architects, and his insider knowledge was devastating in its specificity. "Mr. Weasley," Andromeda began gently, "you've worked closely with Barty Crouch Sr. for how long?" "Nearly 2 years," Percy replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "since I joined the ministry after Hogwarts." "And during that time, did you observe anything unusual about Mr. Crouch's behavior or decision-making patterns?" Percy's internal struggle was visible to everyone in the courtroom. Finally, with evident reluctance, he began to speak. Mr. Crouch received regular correspondence from Professor Dumbledore, private letters that he would read immediately and then file in a locked drawer. He told me they concerned ongoing security matters and that I wasn't to mention them to anyone. How often did this correspondence arrive? Monthly, sometimes more frequently, especially in the months leading up to the Triwizard Tournament. Percy's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if the act of telling the truth was liberating him from the burden of keeping secrets. Mr. Crouch's behavior became increasingly erratic during that period. He would disappear for hours without explanation. He cancelled important meetings to attend confidential briefings that weren't on any official schedule, and he began making policy decisions without consulting the normal departmental review process. "Can you give the court a specific example?" Percy took a deep breath before responding. 3 weeks before the tournament began, Mr. Crouch ordered me to draft a memorandum temporarily suspending certain security protocols at Hogwarts. When I asked why, he said it was to facilitate the tournament's educational objectives. But the protocols he suspended were specifically designed to prevent unauthorized magical items from being brought onto school grounds. The implication hung in the air. Crouch Sr. had deliberately weakened Hogwarts' defenses to allow Barty Crouch Jr.'s infiltration to succeed. "Did you question this decision?" I tried to," Percy admitted, his face flushing with shame. "But Mr. Crouch told me that questioning his orders was tantamount to questioning Dumbledore's judgment, and that such insubordination would end my career before it began." Andromeda nodded sympathetically. "Mr. Weasley, you mentioned that Mr. Crouch disappeared for unexplained meetings. Did you ever discover where he went during these absences?" "Once," Percy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I saw him entering a private flu connection in the Department of Mysteries. When he returned, he looked devastated, as if he'd been forced to do something that went against his nature." "When was this?" The day after the first task of the Triwizard Tournament. The day after Harry Potter faced the Hungarian Horntail. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Crouch Sr. hadn't just been implementing policies. He had been receiving regular briefings about Harry's progress, monitoring his psychological development like a lab experiment. It was at this moment, as Percy's testimony reached its devastating crescendo, that Barty Crouch Sr. made his move. Rising from the defendant's table with sudden determination, he strode toward the courtroom's main exit with the brisk efficiency that had characterized his entire career. "Auras, stop him!" Chief Warlock Fudge commanded. But Crouch Sr. was already pulling out his wand, preparing to disapparate from the Ministry building in direct violation of its anti-apparition wards. The spell he attempted failed, of course. The Ministry's defenses were far too sophisticated to be bypassed so easily. But his attempt to flee was captured by every quick quotes quill in the room, creating a moment of drama that would dominate the front pages of every magical newspaper for weeks to come. Kingsley Shacklebolt and 2 other auras subdued Crouch Sr. with professional efficiency, binding his wands and escorting him back to the defendant's table. But the damage was done. His attempted flight had confirmed his guilt more effectively than any testimony could have. "Mr. Crouch," Chief Warlock Fudge said sternly, "your attempt to flee this proceeding is itself a violation of magical law. Do you have anything to say before we proceed with formal questioning under Veritaserum?" Crouch Sr. looked around the courtroom with the hollow expression of a man who had lost everything. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of moral compromise. "I have spent 15 years serving a cause I believed to be just. If that service is now considered criminal, then I suppose I am guilty." The Veritaserum was administered by a senior ministry healer under full ceremonial protocols. As the truth serum took effect, Crouch Sr.'s rigid posture relaxed slightly, his face taking on the distant expression of someone no longer capable of deception. "State your name and position," Andromeda commanded. Bartemius Crouch Sr., Senior Undersecretary to the Minister, Department of International Magical Cooperation, he replied in the flat monotone that characterized Veritaserum-induced testimony. "Did you conspire with Albus Dumbledore to manipulate Harry Potter's upbringing and education?" "Yes." The simple admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom, but Andromeda pressed on. "For how long did this conspiracy continue?" 15 years. From the night Harry Potter was placed with his relatives until the present day. "Did you deliberately implement policies designed to prevent ministry intervention in Harry Potter's welfare?" "Yes." Every policy directive, every security protocol, every administrative decision regarding the Potter family was coordinated with Professor Dumbledore to ensure that Harry's psychological development proceeded according to plan. "What plan?" Crouch Sr.'s voice remained monotonously matter-of-fact as he revealed the full scope of their manipulation. Harry Potter needed to be psychologically prepared to sacrifice himself in the final confrontation with the Dark Lord. This required careful cultivation of specific personality traits: self-sacrifice, hero complex, willingness to value others' lives above his own. His difficult childhood was designed to produce these traits. And the Triwizard Tournament? A field test. We needed to assess Harry's readiness to face mortal danger for others' sake. The tournament provided controlled conditions for this assessment, while maintaining plausible deniability about our involvement. "Did you know that your son would be used as part of this plan?" For the first time, Crouch Sr.'s voice carried a note of emotion despite the Veritaserum's influence. "Yes, Professor Dumbledore told me that Barty Jr.'s obsession with the Dark Lord could be and redirected to serve our purposes. I agreed to let my son remain Imperius cursed and imprisoned rather than seeking proper treatment for him, because his condition made him useful to the cause." The admission struck the courtroom like a physical blow. Here was a man who had sacrificed not only Harry Potter, but his own son to Dumbledore's grand design. "And you believed this was justified?" "I believed we were saving the wizarding world." Crouch Senior replied simply. I believed that the sacrifice of 2 children, one willing, one already lost, was preferable to the enslavement of our entire society. I still believe that. The honesty of his conviction was perhaps more chilling than outright evil would have been. This was not a man driven by malice or personal gain, but someone who had convinced himself that atrocity was acceptable if the cause was noble enough. Mr. Crouch, Andromeda said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was revealing. Did you ever consider that there might be alternatives to this plan? Other ways to defeat Voldemort that didn't require child sacrifice? Professor Dumbledore explored every alternative, Crouch Senior replied. The prophecy was clear. Only Harry Potter could defeat the Dark Lord. Our only choice was whether he would be prepared for that role or not. And you chose to prepare him through trauma and manipulation. We chose to prepare him through whatever means were necessary. History will judge whether we were right. As the Veritaserum questioning continued, the full scope of the conspiracy became undeniably clear. And 2 of magical Britain's most respected leaders had spent 15 years systematically abusing a child in the name of the greater good. They had manipulated laws, policies, and institutions to ensure their plan could proceed uninterrupted. They had sacrificed innocence, childhood, and basic human dignity on the altar of utilitarian calculation. When the questioning finally ended, Crouch Senior sat in the witness chair with the empty expression of a man who had confessed to everything and found no absolution in the telling. The truth had been revealed, but it had brought no peace, only the terrible clarity of actions that could never be undone. Chief Warlock Fudge called for another recess, but as the courtroom began to empty, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The conspiracy was no longer a matter of interpretation or moral philosophy. It was established fact, confirmed under magical compulsion by one of its architects. Barty Crouch Senior had spent his career building a reputation as an incorruptible defender of magical law. In the end, his greatest crime was not violating that law, but following it too precisely in service of an agenda that treated children as expendable resources. And now the wizarding world would have to decide whether the ends had truly justified the means, or whether some prices were too high to pay, even for victory. The man who had once sent his own son to Azkaban had finally found himself in the dock, and the judgment would reshape everything magical Britain believed about justice, sacrifice, and the true cost of their freedom. In the defendants section, Albus Dumbledore sat in contemplative silence, watching his longtime ally's public destruction with the distant sadness of someone who had always known this day would come. The greater good, it seemed, demanded sacrifices from everyone who served it, even from those who had helped define it. Chapter 9. The Prophet's War. The front page of the Daily Prophet had never carried a headline quite like the one that greeted magical Britain on the morning following Barty Crouch Senior's confession. In letters so large they seemed to vibrate with their own importance, Rita Skeeter's byline declared, "Dumbledore's dark secret. The boy who lived was tortured for the greater good." Beneath the screaming headline, a photograph showed Harry Potter leaving the Wizengamot courtroom, his young face set in determined lines that made him look far older than his 15 years. The image captured the exact moment when he had turned back to deliver his final statement about refusing to be anyone's sacrificial lamb, a moment that was already being called the most important speech in modern wizarding history. Rita Skeeter had outdone herself. Her article, spanning 3 full pages, was a masterpiece of sensational journalism that managed to be both utterly biased and fundamentally accurate. She had painted Dumbledore as a manipulative puppet master and Harry as a tragic hero, while casting Winky as the brave whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the truth. The wizarding world has long celebrated Albus Dumbledore as the greatest wizard of our age, Skeeter wrote in her characteristic breathless prose. But shocking testimony before the Wizengamot reveals a man so consumed with defeating he who must not be named that he was willing to sacrifice a child's happiness, safety, and basic human rights to achieve his goals. The boy who lived, it seems, was never allowed to simply live. The article included extensive quotes from the trial testimony, complete with Skeeter's theatrical embellishments and dramatic interpretations. But beneath the sensationalism lay a devastating indictment that no amount of purple prose could diminish. Two of magical Britain's most trusted leaders had spent 15 years systematically abusing a child. By 9 o'clock that morning, emergency copies of The Prophet were being rushed to magical communities across Europe as international owl post networks strained to meet the unprecedented demand for information. That by noon, delegations from the International Confederation of Wizards were demanding immediate access to the trial transcripts and calling for their own investigation into what they termed the systematic violation of a child's fundamental magical rights. But Rita Skeeter's triumph was short-lived. Within hours of The Prophet's publication, competing narratives began to emerge from Dumbledore's extensive network of supporters and allies. The counter-offensive was led by Cornelius Fudge himself, who held an emergency press conference at the Ministry that afternoon. Flanked by senior aurors and department heads, Fudge presented a carefully crafted alternative interpretation of the evidence. While certain regrettable decisions may have been made, Fudge declared to a room full of reporters, we must not lose sight of the greater context. Professor Dumbledore and Mr. Crouch were operating under the shadow of an imminent threat to our entire civilization. Their methods may have been unorthodox, but their motivation was the protection of every witch, wizard, and magical creature in Britain. The minister's statement was followed by a parade of character witnesses, former Hogwarts students who credited Dumbledore with saving their lives, Order of the Phoenix members who spoke of his courage during the last war, and ministry officials who testified to his decades of service to magical society. The message was clear. Whatever his methods, Dumbledore remained a hero whose contributions far outweighed any temporary harm done to one individual. But it was the coverage in the Quibbler that provided the most unexpected perspective on the unfolding crisis. De Xenophilius Lovegood had never been accused of conventional journalism, and his coverage of what he termed the Great Revelation was characteristically unique. Rather than focusing on the political implications or the legal maneuvering, Lovegood chose to examine the magical and philosophical dimensions of what had been revealed. The house elf speaks truth as naturally as she breathes, Lovegood wrote in his distinctive, dreamy style. Her magic compels honesty about her master's words and deeds, making her testimony as reliable as a pensive memory. In recognizing Winky's right to speak before the Wizengamot, magical Britain has taken the first step toward acknowledging that wisdom and moral clarity are not the exclusive domain of wizards. But perhaps more importantly, young Harry Potter's testimony reveals a truth that transcends legal proceedings or political maneuvering, that love cannot be manufactured through suffering, that heroism cannot be created through trauma, and that the greatest magic of all is the courage to choose one's own path regardless of the expectations others place upon us. The Quibbler's coverage struck a chord with readers who were tired of the sensationalism and political posturing dominating other publications. Lovegood's circulation tripled overnight as witches and wizards sought a perspective that focused on the human rather than the political dimensions of the crisis. Meanwhile, the public response to the revelations was swift and dramatic. By the second day after Crouch Sr.'s confession, the crowds had gathered outside both the Ministry of Magic and Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The demonstrations were largely peaceful but passionate, with protesters carrying signs that ranged from "Children are not weapons" to "Dumbledore, hero or villain." The division in public opinion was stark and troubling. Older wizards, particularly those who had lived through Grindelwald's rise and Voldemort's first reign of terror, tended to support Dumbledore's utilitarian approach. They understood the terrible mathematics of war and were willing to accept that individual sacrifice might be necessary for collective survival. Younger witches and wizards, especially those with children of their own, were far more likely to condemn the conspiracy. They saw in Harry's testimony an indictment of a system that treated children as expendable resources and demanded accountability from those who had betrayed the trust placed in them. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Other families began coming forward with their own stories of manipulation and exploitation. The first letter arrived at the Daily Prophet's offices 3 days after the initial story broke. It came from Augusta Longbottom, the formidable grandmother of Neville Longbottom, and its contents sent shockwaves through the magical community. For years the letter read, "I have wondered why the ministry showed so little interest in properly investigating the attack on my son and daughter-in-law. Now I understand. Their suffering, like Harry Potter's, was served a purpose in Professor Dumbledore's larger plan. Neville was shaped by his parents' fate, just as deliberately as Harry was shaped by his relatives' cruelty. We were all pieces on Dumbledore's chessboard, and none of us even knew the game was being played." Augusta Longbottom's letter opened floodgates. Within a week, the Prophet was receiving dozens of similar testimonials from families across magical Britain. Parents whose children had faced unusual dangers at Hogwarts, students who had been encouraged to take extraordinary risks for the greater good, families whose loved ones had died in circumstances that suddenly seemed less random and more orchestrated. Each letter added another layer to the emerging picture of a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. Dumbledore had not simply manipulated Harry Potter, he had been manipulating the entire wizarding world, using tragedy and trauma as tools to shape the next generation according to his vision of what was necessary. The international response was equally dramatic. The Bulgarian Ministry of Magic, responding to inquiries from their own press, revealed that Victor Crumb had been specifically selected for the Tri-Wizard tournament, not for his Quidditch skills, but for his potential influence on Harry Potter's development. The French magical government disclosed that Fleur Delacour's participation had been similarly orchestrated, with Dumbledore personally requesting her inclusion in the selection process. Even the Goblin community at Gringotts Bank issued an unprecedented public statement expressing concern about the systematic manipulation of a minor's inheritance rights and calling for greater oversight of magical guardianship arrangements. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Hermione Granger and Winky found themselves thrust into the spotlight as unlikely celebrities. Reporters followed them wherever they went, seeking quotes and insights about their role in exposing the truth. Book publishers offered substantial contracts for their memoirs, while speaking bureaus promised lucrative lecture tours across Europe. Hermione handled the attention with characteristic intelligence and determination, using every interview as an opportunity to advocate for stronger protections for magical children and greater rights for house elves. She appeared on the Wizarding Wireless Network's most popular talk shows, spoke at emergency sessions of the International Confederation of Wizards, and penned thoughtful opinion pieces for newspapers across the magical world. "This isn't about destroying Dumbledore's reputation," she said, during one particularly well-received interview. "It's about ensuring that no child ever again suffers in silence, while adults make plans for their life without their consent. It's about building a magical world that protects the vulnerable instead of exploiting them." Winky, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, initially retreated from public view. But gradually, with Hermione's encouragement and Andromeda's legal guidance, she began to understand the power of her position. As the first house elf to successfully testify before the Wizengamot, she had become a symbol of magical creature rights and a voice for those who had been systematically silenced by centuries of discrimination. Her first public appearance since the trial was at a rally organized by the Society for the Protection of Elfish Welfare, which had seen its membership explode from a handful of Hogwarts students to thousands of witches and wizards across Europe. Standing on a platform in Diagon Alley, speaking to a crowd of supporters who hung on her every word, Winky delivered a speech that would be remembered as a watershed moment in magical civil rights. Winky did not speak to become famous, she said, then her voice carrying clearly through the crowd thanks to sonorous charms. Winky spoke because someone had to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. House elves, yes, but also children who are told they must suffer for the greater good. All beings who are considered less important than the plans made by powerful wizards. She paused, her large eyes surveying the diverse crowd that had gathered to hear her. Wizards and witches, goblins and centaurs, even a delegation of ghosts who had materialized to show their support. Winky learned that truth is more powerful than magic, she continued. Truth cannot be silenced by authority, cannot be hidden by reputation, cannot be dismissed because it comes from unexpected voices. Truth spoke through Winky, and truth will speak through others who refuse to be silent. The rally was attended by representatives from magical governments across Europe, journalists from dozens of publications, and ordinary witches and wizards who were beginning to understand that the revelations about Harry Potter's treatment had implications far beyond one boy's suffering. As the weeks passed and the media storm continued to rage, certain themes began to emerge from the chaos. The fundamental question was not whether Dumbledore and Crouch Sr. had acted as accused. Their guilt was established beyond doubt. The question was whether their actions could be justified by the circumstances they faced and the results they achieved. Public opinion surveys conducted by the Department of Magical Polls showed the wizarding population almost evenly split. 42% believed that Dumbledore's methods, however harsh, had been necessary to defeat Voldemort. 38% condemned his actions as indefensible child abuse regardless of their strategic value. 20% remained undecided, struggling to reconcile their admiration for Dumbledore's past achievements with their horror at the methods he had employed. But perhaps the most significant shift in public opinion came not from the political debates or legal arguments, but from a simple observation made by Luna Lovegood during one of her father's radio interviews. "Everyone keeps asking whether Harry Potter should forgive Professor Dumbledore," she said in her characteristically dreamy voice. "But isn't the more important question whether we can forgive ourselves for allowing this to happen? We all knew something was wrong. The boy lived in a cupboard. He arrived at school, underfed and poorly clothed. He faced dangers that no child should face. We knew, and we did nothing, because it was easier to believe in the stories we told ourselves about heroes and destiny." Her words sparked a new phase in the public conversation, one that moved beyond the guilt or innocence of specific individuals to examine the systemic failures that had made the conspiracy possible. How had an entire society allowed a child to suffer in plain sight? What institutions needed to change to prevent such abuses in the future? How could magical Britain rebuild trust between its leaders and the people they claimed to serve? As Chapter 9 drew to a close, the media war showed no signs of abating. If anything, the revelations about Harry Potter had opened a Pandora's box of questions about power, responsibility, and the true meaning of the greater good. The wizarding world was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, and the outcome of that confrontation would determine not just the fate of Dumbledore and his co-conspirators, but the very nature of magical society itself. In her small flat above Diagon Alley, Rita Skeeter sat at her desk, her quick quotes quill poised over a fresh piece of parchment. She had broken the story of the century, but she understood that the real story was just beginning. The trial would end eventually, verdicts would be rendered, and punishments would be assigned. But the questions raised by a house elf's courage and a young man's refusal to be defined by others' expectations would echo through the magical world for generations to come. And for perhaps the first time in her career, Rita Skeeter found herself hoping that her next story would be about healing rather than scandal, about justice rather than sensation, about a community that had learned to protect its children instead of sacrificing them. The Prophet's war was far from over, but at least now everyone understood what they were fighting for. Chapter 10. Allies and Enemies. The corridors of Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had never felt as tense as they did in the week following the meteor explosion. Though the school year had officially ended, many staff members remained on the grounds, ostensibly to prepare for the next term, but in reality to grapple with the implications of what had been revealed about their beloved headmaster. The ancient castle itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see whether its legacy of protecting children would survive the scandal that threatened to destroy everything its founders had built. In the depths of the dungeons, Severus Snape sat in his private chambers, staring at a letter that had arrived by Ministry Owl that morning. It was a formal summons to provide additional testimony before the Wizengamot, specifically regarding his knowledge of Dumbledore's long-term plans and his own role in implementing them. The letter was signed by Andromeda Tonks and marked with the official seal that made it legally binding. Snape had been expecting this summons since the moment Winky had first taken the witness stand. As Dumbledore's most trusted lieutenant, as someone who had access to information that few others possessed, he had always known that eventually someone would ask him to choose between loyalty and truth. The question was not whether he would be called to testify. The question was what he would say when he was. For 15 years, Severus Snape had walked a tightrope between competing loyalties, serving masters whose demands often contradicted each other. He had protected Harry Potter while despising him, had served Dumbledore while questioning his methods, had preserved secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. Now, faced with the collapse of the carefully constructed lies that had governed his adult life, he found himself in the unusual position of being able to speak the truth without betraying anyone, because all the secrets had already been exposed. 3 days later, Snape's testimony before the Wizengamot sent shockwaves through magical Britain that rivaled the initial revelations about the conspiracy. Unlike the character witnesses who had spoken in Dumbledore's defense, Snape offered no qualifications or equivocations. His testimony was precise, damning, and delivered with the cold fury of someone who had spent years being used as an instrument of manipulation. Professor Dumbledore informed me of his plans for Harry Potter during my initial interview for the position of Potions Master, Snape told the hushed courtroom. Or he made it clear that my primary responsibility would be to monitor the boy's psychological development and ensure that his experiences at Hogwarts aligned with the headmaster's long-term objectives. The admission struck the courtroom like a physical blow. Here was confirmation that even Harry's education had been orchestrated, that his teachers had been recruited not just to instruct him, but to shape him according to Dumbledore's design. "And what were those objectives?" Andromeda asked. Snape's voice remained steady and emotionless as he delivered his devastating testimony. To cultivate in Harry Potter a willingness to sacrifice himself for others. To ensure that when the time came for him to face Voldemort in what Dumbledore termed the final confrontation, the boy would choose death rather than self-preservation. "Were you ever asked to participate directly in this cultivation?" "I was instructed to maintain a hostile relationship with Potter, to ensure that he received no comfort or encouragement from authority figures at the school. Dumbledore believed that emotional isolation would strengthen the boy's determination to prove himself worthy of others' sacrifice." The courtroom erupted in angry whispers and gasps of disbelief. The idea that a teacher had been deliberately cruel to a student as part of an educational strategy was almost too monstrous to comprehend. "Did you ever object to these instructions?" Andromeda pressed. For the first time, Snape's composure wavered slightly. "I questioned the wisdom of certain approaches, but Professor Dumbledore reminded me that my own redemption depended on my willingness to serve his vision of the greater good. He made it clear that any deviation from his instructions would result in my immediate dismissal and a full revelation of my past associations with the dark arts. In other words, he blackmailed you into complying with his abuse of a student." "That is an accurate summary, yes." Snape's testimony continued for hours, revealing layer after layer of manipulation and control that extended far beyond Harry Potter. He described how Dumbledore had orchestrated student rivalries to encourage specific personality developments, how he had deliberately placed children in dangerous situations to test their character, how he had used the threat of expulsion, or worse, to ensure staff compliance with his methods. When the cross-examination began, Dumbledore's legal team attempted to portray Snape as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but their efforts fell flat against the specificity and consistency of his testimony. Unlike emotional witnesses who might be swayed by personal feelings, Snape provided dates, times, direct quotes, and documented evidence for every allegation he made. The impact of Snape's testimony was felt far beyond the courtroom. Within hours, other unexpected allies began to emerge from the shadows, adding their voices to the growing chorus demanding accountability. Remus Lupin's letter to the Daily Prophet was published the following morning, and its contents provided yet another perspective on Dumbledore's methods. For years, I convinced myself that Albus Dumbledore's treatment of Harry Potter was motivated by necessary caution and wise strategy. I told myself that the hardships the boy faced were unfortunate coincidences rather than deliberate orchestrations. I was wrong, and my willingness to remain silent in the face of obvious suffering makes me complicit in the abuse that has been revealed. I write this letter not to seek absolution. My failures cannot be forgiven simply because I acknowledge them, but to add my voice to those demanding that we do better. Harry Potter deserved protectors, not manipulators. He deserved advocates, not architects of his suffering. If we claim to be the people who fight for the light, well, then we must prove worthy of that claim by protecting our children instead of sacrificing them. Lupin's letter was followed by a formal statement from Nymphadora Tonks, speaking in her capacity as an Auror and as someone who had witnessed the Ministry's complicity in the conspiracy. The Auror Corps swore an oath to protect all citizens of magical Britain, without exception and without regard to political convenience. We failed in that oath when we failed to investigate reports of abuse, when we prioritized institutional loyalty over individual welfare, when we allowed our superiors to compromise our integrity in service of their agenda. I call upon my fellow Aurors to join me in demanding a complete review of Ministry policies regarding child welfare, magical creature rights, and the oversight of educational institutions. We cannot undo the harm that has been done, but we can ensure that such failures never occur again. The support from Lupin and Tonks provided Harry with adult allies who had no ulterior motives, no hidden agendas, no complex loyalties that might compromise their advocacy. For perhaps the first time since the scandal broke, Harry found himself surrounded by people who simply wanted to help him heal rather than use him for their own purposes. But not all the political maneuvering was motivated by altruism or justice. In Malfoy Manor, Lucius Malfoy sat in his study with the satisfied expression of a man who had just been handed an unexpected political gift. The scandal surrounding Dumbledore represented an opportunity to reshape the power structure of magical Britain, and Malfoy was nothing if not an opportunist. "May the timing could not be more perfect," he told his wife Narcissa, as they reviewed the daily intelligence reports that their network of contacts provided. With Dumbledore's reputation destroyed, and Fudge scrambling to distance himself from the conspiracy, there is a vacuum in the leadership of magical Britain that someone must fill. Narcissa, always more pragmatic than her husband, raised an eyebrow at his obvious satisfaction. "And you believe you are the person to fill that vacuum?" "Not me, personally," Lucius replied, with the kind of calculated humility that never fooled anyone. "But someone with proven credentials in fighting against dangerous ideologies, someone who has consistently opposed the kind of extremism that led to this abuse of an innocent child." It was a masterful reframing of his own history. But by positioning himself as an opponent of extremism rather than as a former Death Eater seeking rehabilitation, Malfoy hoped to transform his past associations into political assets. Who better to recognize and oppose dangerous fanaticism than someone who had once been seduced by it himself? Within days, Malfoy's carefully orchestrated campaign was in full swing. He provided generous donations to magical children's charities, offered to fund new oversight mechanisms for educational institutions, and gave thoughtful interviews about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The campaign was cynical and opportunistic, but it was also politically astute. By aligning himself with the victims of Dumbledore's conspiracy rather than trying to defend the old order, Malfoy positioned himself as a voice for reform rather than reaction. But perhaps the most significant political development came from an unexpected source: Augusta Longbottom, the formidable matriarch of one of magical Britain's oldest families. Augusta's appearance before the Wizengamot was not as a witness, but as a petitioner, demanding a formal investigation into what she termed the systematic manipulation of magical families for political purposes. Her petition was accompanied by documentation spanning decades, meticulously researched and legally precise. "My grandson Neville has lived his entire life in the shadow of his parents' fate," Augusta told the assembled court, her voice carrying the authority that came from 60 years of social prominence and political influence. "But I have now learned that this shadow was not the result of tragic circumstance, but of deliberate policy. Professor Dumbledore ensured that Neville would grow up believing himself inadequate, believing that he must constantly prove himself worthy of his parents' sacrifice. She presented letters, reports, and official documents that painted a picture of calculated psychological manipulation extending far beyond the Potter family. The Longbottoms, the Weasleys, even families like the Diggorys, all had been shaped by policies and decisions that prioritized Dumbledore's vision of necessary character development over the welfare of individual children. "I demand accountability," Augusta declared, her voice rising with righteous anger. "Not just for what was done to Harry Potter, but for what was done to an entire generation of magical children who were treated as raw materials for someone else's war." But perhaps the most emotionally devastating revelation came in the form of documents that had been filed years earlier with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, documents that had been buried in ministry archives until Andromeda's investigation brought them to light. The papers bore the signature of Sirius Black and were dated just 6 months after his name had been officially cleared. They were formal petitions requesting guardianship of his godson, detailed legal arguments for why Harry Potter should be removed from the Dursley household, and comprehensive reports documenting the abuse and neglect the boy had suffered. Each petition had been denied, each legal argument dismissed, each report filed away without investigation. The pattern was clear. Sirius had been trying for months to rescue Harry from his abusive situation, only to be thwarted at every turn by ministry officials acting on Dumbledore's instructions. When the documents were presented in court, Harry's composure finally cracked. To learn that someone had been fighting for him, that his godfather had been trying to save him while he suffered in ignorance, the revelation was both healing and heartbreaking. "Sirius tried to get me out," Harry said during a brief recess, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke to Andromeda and Hermione. "He tried, and they stopped him. They knew I was being hurt, and they stopped the person who wanted to help me." The discovery of Sirius's petitions added another layer to the conspiracy, of revealing that the cover-up had extended beyond passive neglect to active obstruction of efforts to help Harry. It also provided evidence that there had been alternatives to Dumbledore's approach, people who had been willing and able to provide Harry with a safe, loving home if the system had allowed it. But perhaps the most significant development was the split that began to emerge within the Order of the Phoenix itself. The Order was a secret organization that most of the public knew nothing about, but its members included many of the most influential figures in magical Britain. They had been bound together by their shared loyalty to Dumbledore and their commitment to fighting dark magic. But the revelations about Harry's treatment created fractures that threatened to tear the organization apart. Some members, particularly those who had served with Dumbledore during the war against Grindelwald, remained steadfast in their support. They argued that the Order's leader had made difficult but necessary choices, that the defeat of Voldemort justified whatever methods had been employed, that second-guessing wartime decisions from the safety of peacetime was both naive and dangerous. Others, particularly younger members who had joined the Order, based on idealistic beliefs about justice and protection, found themselves horrified by what they learned. They demanded accountability, reform, and a fundamental re-examination of the principles that guided their organization. The split was exemplified by the public resignation of Kingsley Shacklebolt from his position as an Aura liaison to the Order. His letter of resignation, leaked to the press by unknown sources, became a rallying cry for those demanding change. I joined the Order of the Phoenix because I believed in protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. I cannot remain part of an organization that has itself become complicit in the harm of innocents. Until the Order acknowledges its failures and commits to genuine reform, I cannot in good conscience continue to serve. As Chapter 10 drew to a close, the political landscape of magical Britain had been fundamentally altered. Traditional alliances had crumbled, new coalitions were forming, and the very definition of heroism was being re-examined by a society forced to confront uncomfortable truths about its most revered leaders. In the midst of this chaos, Harry Potter found himself surrounded by unexpected allies, people who supported him not because of prophecies or political calculations, but because they believed he deserved better than he had received. For the first time in his life, Harry began to understand what it felt like to be protected rather than used, advocated for rather than manipulated. The battle for justice was far from over, but at least now Harry knew he would not have to fight it alone. And in the end, that knowledge might be worth more than all the political maneuvering and legal proceedings that had brought them to this point. The boy who had survived was finally learning that survival was not enough. He deserved to flourish, to grow, to choose his own path forward. And there were people who would fight to ensure he had that choice. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. The ancient Wizengamot courtroom had witnessed many historic moments in its centuries of existence, but none quite like this. As the final day of proceedings began, every seat was filled not just with spectators, but with the weight of history itself. The very foundations of magical Britain's government were being tested, its most fundamental assumptions about justice, authority, and the protection of the innocent hanging in the balance. Chief Warlock Fudge presided over the proceedings with the grave demeanor of a man who understood that the decisions made in this chamber today would echo through generations. Behind him, the tiered benches of the Wizengamot held 50 of magical Britain's most senior officials, their faces reflecting the profound division that had split their ranks over the past weeks. The morning began with final arguments, each side given one last opportunity to present their case before the court rendered its judgment. Dumbledore's lead counsel, Travers, rose first with the polished confidence of someone who had spent decades defending the indefensible. His argument was sophisticated, nuanced, and ultimately built on a foundation of moral relativism that would have impressed philosophers while horrifying parents. "Members of the Wizengamot," Travers began, his voice carrying the measured authority of centuries of legal precedent. "We are not here today to judge whether Professor Dumbledore's methods were pleasant or comfortable. We are here to determine whether they were necessary and justified, given the extraordinary circumstances he faced." He gestured toward the evidence table, where weeks of testimony had created a mountain of documentation. "The evidence is clear. Professor Dumbledore and Mr. Crouch faced an enemy who had already proven himself capable of destroying our entire civilization. They were tasked with preparing the only person capable of defeating this enemy, not for a comfortable life, but for an ultimate confrontation that would determine the fate of every witch, wizard, and magical creature in Britain." Travers's argument was elegant in its simplicity. When faced with existential threats, normal moral considerations must yield to survival imperatives. The suffering of one child, however regrettable, was justified by the prevention of suffering for millions. "Consider the alternative," Travers continued, his voice rising with practiced passion. If Harry Potter had been raised in comfort and safety, coddled and protected, would he have had the strength of character necessary to face Voldemort? Would he have developed the willingness to sacrifice himself for others that the prophecy demanded? Or would our entire world now be enslaved because we lacked the courage to make difficult choices? It was a powerful argument that resonated with many in the courtroom who remembered the First War's devastation. But when Andromeda Tonks rose to present the prosecution's final argument, her approach was fundamentally different. "Members of the Wizengamot," she began, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "My learned colleague asks you to weigh one child's suffering against the safety of millions. But this framing accepts a false premise, that Harry Potter's abuse was necessary for his preparation as our defender." She moved to stand directly before the evidence table, her hand resting on the thick stack of correspondence that had documented 15 years of systematic manipulation. "The evidence shows that Professor Dumbledore had many alternatives. Harry Potter could have been raised by loving guardians who would have taught him courage through example rather than through trauma. He could have been prepared for his role through training and education rather than through psychological manipulation. The prophecy spoke of his power to defeat Voldemort. It said nothing about requiring his deliberate traumatization." Andromeda's voice grew stronger as she continued, passion breaking through her professional composure. "But perhaps more importantly, the defense asks you to accept that children are acceptable sacrifices for adult wars, that their suffering is justified if it serves our purposes, that their consent is irrelevant if we decide their lives belong to causes greater than themselves." She turned to face the Wizengamot directly, her eyes meeting those of members who were parents and grandparents themselves. "If we accept this logic, what prevents future leaders from deciding that other children must suffer for other causes? How do we tell the next Dumbledore that his utilitarian calculations are wrong while accepting that these ones were right?" The contrast between the two arguments was stark, Travers appealing to fear and necessity, Andromeda to principle and precedent. The courtroom fell into tense silence as the implications of both positions settled over the assembly. It was then that Chief Warlock Fudge made an unprecedented announcement. "Before the court renders its judgment," he said, his voice carrying the weight of historical significance, "the witness Winky has requested permission to make a final statement. Given her unique position as the primary witness whose testimony initiated these proceedings, the court will grant this request." Winky rose from her seat in the witness area with a dignity that had grown throughout the weeks of proceedings. She was no longer the broken, alcoholic house elf who had first appeared before Hermione Granger. The process of speaking truth had transformed her, revealing the strength that had always existed beneath centuries of enforced servitude. "Winky comes before the Wizengamot, not as a creature seeking justice for herself," she began, her voice carrying with perfect clarity despite her small stature. "Winky comes to speak for all those who have no voice in the chambers where their fates are decided." She paused, her large eyes surveying the assembled officials with a gravity that would have seemed impossible from a house elf just months earlier. "The bond between house elf and wizard family is magic that compels truth about masters' words and deeds. This bond, wizards have told Winky, makes house elves property, creatures who cannot lie about their owners because we belong to them. But Winky has learned that this bond has a deeper purpose." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, each word carrying the weight of revolutionary insight. "House elves are truth keepers. Our magic ensures that the powerful cannot hide their words and deeds from history. We remember what masters think others will forget. We preserve truth even when it is inconvenient." The courtroom was absolutely silent, every person present understanding that they were witnessing a fundamental redefinition of house elf nature and purpose. Wizards created the bond between elf and family, believing it would ensure our loyalty and silence, Winky continued. But magic has its own wisdom. The bond that makes us remember also makes us responsible for speaking when silence enables harm. Winky's duty to truth was not betrayal of her masters, it was fulfillment of her deepest magical nature. She looked directly at Dumbledore, who sat in the defendants section with an expression of profound sadness. Professor Dumbledore is a great wizard who has done great things. But great wizards who abuse children are still abusers of children. The good they do does not erase the harm they cause. Their power does not justify their cruelty. Finally, she turned to address the full assembly, her voice rising with moral authority that transcended species boundaries. Winky asks the Wizengamot to remember that justice is not about punishing the guilty. It is about protecting the innocent. Today's judgment will tell every child in magical Britain whether their suffering matters, whether their consent is required before their lives are planned by others, whether they will be protected by their society or sacrificed for its convenience. She bowed once, formally, and returned to her seat. The silence that followed was the silence of a world shifting on its axis. Chief Warlock Fudge called for a recess to allow the Wizengamot to deliberate. The 50 members filed into their private chambers while the courtroom emptied, leaving behind the kind of charged atmosphere that precedes earthquakes. 3 hours later, the court reconvened for the rendering of judgment. In the matter of allegations of conspiracy to endanger a minor, abuse of magical authority, and systematic violation of child welfare protections, Chief Warlock Fudge announced, his voice heavy with the weight of historical consequence, the Wizengamot has reached its decision by a vote of 32 to 18. The narrow margin reflected the deep divisions that would continue to split magical society long after the trial ended. The court finds that, while Professor Albus Dumbledore and Mr. Bartemius Crouch Sr. acted with the intention of protecting magical Britain from existential threat, their methods constituted systematic abuse of a minor and deliberate circumvention of established child welfare protections. A ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom, but Fudge continued with formal precision. Professor Dumbledore is hereby censured by this body and stripped of his positions as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and Chairman of the Hogwarts Board of Governors. He retains his position as Headmaster of Hogwarts, subject to review by the reconstituted Board of Governors. The sentence was harsh but not devastating. Dumbledore would lose most of his political power, but retain his primary role as educator. The court had chosen reform over destruction. Mr. Bartemius Crouch Sr. is sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment in Azkaban, with credit for time served and eligibility for early release pending completion of community service related to magical child welfare advocacy. The sentence reflected Crouch Sr.'s cooperation and his own victimization by the system he had served, while ensuring that consequences existed for his actions. Furthermore, Fudge continued, his voice taking on the tone of historical pronouncement, the court orders the following immediate remedial actions. First, Harry James Potter is granted full legal emancipation from all existing guardianship arrangements and is recognized as a legal adult with full autonomy over his person, property, and future decisions. Harry's face showed no surprise. Andromeda had prepared him for this outcome, but relief was visible in his relaxed posture for the first time since the proceedings began. Put it second, the witness Winky is hereby granted full citizenship in magical Britain with all rights and protections thereof, and is formally released from all bonds of servitude to any wizard family. The unprecedented grant of citizenship to a house elf sent shockwaves through the assembly that would reverberate through magical society for generations. Third, the Wizengamot directs the immediate drafting and passage of the Child Protection Act of 1995, establishing independent oversight of all magical educational institutions and mandatory reporting requirements for suspected child abuse. Fourth, the House Elf Freedom Act of 1995 shall be drafted, establishing legal frameworks for house elf citizenship, labor rights, and protection from abuse. Fifth, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission shall be established to investigate other instances of institutional child abuse and to develop recommendations for systemic reform. As the formal pronouncements concluded, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of celebration and protest. Supporters of reform cheered the vindication of Harry and Winky, while traditionalists mourned the destruction of respected institutions and leaders. But in the witness area, Harry Potter and Winky sat quietly together, two beings who had refused to accept the roles others had written for them and had changed the world through their courage to speak truth. "What happens now?" Harry asked Winky, as the chaos swirled around them. "Now Harry Potter chooses his own path," Winky replied with a small smile. "And Winky learns what freedom means for a house elf who is no longer bound to serve. And if I choose to fight Voldemort anyway? Then Harry Potter fights, because Harry Potter decides to fight," Winky said firmly. "Not because prophecies or headmasters command it. That is what freedom means, the right to choose one's own battles." As they left the courtroom together, Harry felt something he had never experienced before, the weight of genuine choice. For the first time in his life, his future was entirely his own to determine. The reckoning was complete. Justice had been served, though not in the dramatic way that stories usually demanded. The guilty had been held accountable, the victims had been vindicated, and systems had been reformed to prevent future abuses. Most importantly, the two beings who had been treated as objects to be used had reclaimed their agency and become agents of change. In the end, that transformation might be worth more than all the political maneuvering and legal proceedings that had preceded it. The wizarding world would never be the same, and for the first time in years, that felt like a hopeful promise rather than a threat. Chapter 12. After the Storm. The burrow had always been a home that expanded to accommodate whoever needed shelter, and in the weeks following the Wizengamot's verdict, it stretched itself once more to welcome its newest permanent resident. Harry Potter sat at the kitchen table on a warm July morning, watching Mrs. Weasley fuss over breakfast preparations with the fond exasperation of someone who was still learning what it felt like to be genuinely cared for. "Are more eggs, dear?" Molly asked, already spooning another helping onto his plate before he could answer. "You're still too thin. All those years with those dreadful relatives. Well, never mind about them now. You're home where you belong. Home." The word still felt foreign on Harry's tongue, but it was growing more familiar each day. His legal emancipation had given him the right to live wherever he chose, and his choice had surprised no one who truly knew him. The burrow might be crowded and chaotic, held together more by love than by magic, but it was the first place that had ever felt like home rather than simply shelter. Ron looked up from his own mountainous breakfast, grinning at Harry's bemused expression. "Better get used to it, mate. Mum's been planning your proper feeding since you were 11. Now she's got legal guardian rights over you. She's making up for lost time." "I'm not his guardian," Molly corrected firmly. "I'm just his family. There's a difference." And there was. Harry had lived with guardians before, people who had legal authority over him, but no emotional investment in his welfare. The Weasleys offered something entirely different: belonging without ownership, protection without manipulation, love without conditions. Arthur Weasley entered the kitchen through the flue connection, his ministry robes singed from what had clearly been another eventful day in the post-trial chaos that still gripped magical Britain. The Child Protection Act and House Elf Freedom Act had created a bureaucratic revolution that was keeping everyone at the ministry working overtime. "Any news?" Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. The constant scrutiny of his life in the magical press had only intensified since the trial's conclusion. Arthur settled into his chair with a weary sigh. The French delegation approved the new international child welfare protocols this morning. Germany and Sweden have already implemented similar legislation. Rita Skeeter's book proposal was rejected by 17 publishers. Apparently even they have standards. "And Dumbledore?" Hermione asked quietly. She had been staying at the burrow as well, helping Harry adjust to his newfound freedom while preparing for her own next steps. Still at Hogwarts, but the new Board of Governors is conducting a comprehensive review of school policies. McGonagall has been appointed deputy head with expanded oversight responsibilities. Arthur's expression grew thoughtful. From what I hear, he spends most of his time in his office these days. The weight of everything. It's aged him considerably. Harry felt a complex mix of emotions at the mention of his former headmaster. Anger was still there, certainly, but it was tempered now by something that might have been pity. Dumbledore had fallen from a great height, and the landing had been devastating. His legacy, once unassailable, would forever be complicated by the revelations about his methods. "Do you think he regrets it?" Harry asked. "What he did?" "I think," Arthur said carefully, "that Albus Dumbledore is learning the difference between being sorry for consequences and being sorry for choices. It's a distinction he should have learned decades ago." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar house elf, though she appeared quite different from the broken creature who had first approached Hermione months earlier. Winky wore professional robes in deep blue, with a small silver badge identifying her as a legal advocate for magical creature rights. Her transformation was remarkable, not just in appearance, but in the confidence that radiated from her small frame. "Good morning, Weasley family," Winky said, with a formal bow that was respectful rather than servile. Winky comes to invite Harry Potter and Hermione Granger to the opening of the new advocacy office. "How are the other cases developing?" Hermione asked eagerly. Since the trial's conclusion, she had been working closely with Winky and Andromeda to establish legal frameworks for house elf rights and to investigate other instances of institutional abuse. 17 house elves have applied for citizenship, Winky reported with obvious pride. 12 magical families have requested mediation services to renegotiate their relationships with house elf employees, and the Hogwarts house elves have formed a union to negotiate working conditions and educational opportunities. The changes rippling through magical society were profound and sometimes chaotic. Centuries of accepted practice were being questioned, institutions were being reformed, and individuals throughout the magical world were being forced to examine their own complicity in systems they had never bothered to question. "Oh, and the other investigation?" Harry asked quietly. Winky's expression grew more serious. "The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has received 43 formal complaints alleging institutional abuse or neglect of magical children. Augusta Longbottom chairs the commission, and she is very thorough." Harry nodded, unsurprised. Augusta Longbottom had thrown herself into the work of reform with the focused determination of someone who had discovered that her own family had been manipulated and was committed to ensuring it never happened again. "What about you, Hermione?" Ron asked, changing the subject with the sensitivity that he had developed over the years. "Any word from the International Confederation?" Hermione's face lit up with excitement. "They've offered me an internship position with their newly created Department of Magical Creature Welfare. It's only part-time while I finish my education, but it's exactly what I've been hoping for." "And it's important work," Arthur added approvingly. "The changes we've made here are already influencing policy across Europe. Having someone with your expertise and passion involved will make all the difference." As the family continued their breakfast conversation, Harry felt a familiar sense of contentment settle over him. This was what he had been fighting for without even realizing it, not the grand destiny of saving the world, but the simple right to choose his own battles, surround himself with people who cared about him, and build a life based on his own values rather than others' expectations. Later that morning, Harry and Winky found themselves walking through the gardens behind the burrow, enjoying one of those rare moments of quiet that had become precious in the wake of their public notoriety. The summer sun filtered through the apple trees, casting dappled shadows on the path as they walked in comfortable silence. "Winky has been thinking," she said finally, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone that Harry had come to associate with her most profound observations. "About what happened about what it means. And what do you think it means? Harry asked. Winky thinks that truth is like water, she replied, pausing to examine a particularly beautiful flower. It finds the cracks in even the strongest walls. It seeps into places where it is not wanted. It changes everything it touches. Harry considered this as they continued walking. Do you regret it? Speaking out, I mean. Everything that's happened since? Winky turned to look at him, her large eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed far older than her years. Winky regrets that truth was necessary. Winky regrets that children were hurt. Winky regrets that powerful wizards made choices that required someone to speak against them. She paused. But Winky does not regret speaking. Truth spoken is truth preserved. Silence would have changed nothing. They walked on. Two beings who had refused to accept the roles others had written for them and had changed the world through their courage to demand better. What will you do now? Winky asked. Now that Harry Potter is free to choose his own path? Harry had been wrestling with that question since the moment the Wizengamot had granted his emancipation. That for the first time in his life, his future was entirely his own to determine. The prophecy still existed. Voldemort was still out there somewhere, and the wizarding world still faced genuine threats. But how he responded to those challenges would be his choice, not destiny's demand. I think I'll prepare, he said finally. Learn everything I can about fighting dark magic. Train with people who want to teach me rather than manipulate me. And when the time comes to face Voldemort again, because it will come, I'll face him as Harry Potter, not as anyone's weapon or symbol or sacrifice. And if others try to make plans for Harry Potter's life? Harry's smile was sharp with newfound confidence. Then they'll discover that Harry Potter has learned to make his own plans. That evening, as the burrow settled into its usual comfortable chaos, Harry sat in his room, in a home he had chosen, with a piece of parchment and a quill. An idea had been forming in his mind since the trial's conclusion, a way to preserve the lessons he had learned and the promises he wanted to make to his future self. He began to write. To Harry Potter, age 25, or whenever you read this. I'm writing this letter on July 15th, 1995, 3 weeks after the Wizengamot trial that changed everything. I'm 15 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm free to choose my own path. I want to remember how this feels, and I want you to remember why I made the choices I'm about to make. I learned some things during the trial that I never want to forget. First, no cause, no matter how noble, justifies the deliberate suffering of children. The greater good becomes the greatest evil when it treats people as expendable resources. Second, truth is more powerful than authority. When someone with power tells you that questioning them is dangerous or wrong, that's usually when questioning becomes most necessary. Third, being willing to sacrifice yourself for others is noble. But that nobility only exists when the sacrifice is your choice, not when it's expected or demanded or manipulated out of you. I'm going to fight against Voldemort when the time comes, not because a prophecy says I must, but because I choose to fight against anyone who would hurt innocent people. And I'm going to do it my way, with allies I trust, using methods I can live with. If you're reading this years from now, I hope you've kept these promises. Never use someone else's suffering to achieve your goals, no matter how important those goals seem. Never sacrifice others without their consent, even if you believe it's for their own good. Never become so focused on defeating enemies that you forget to protect the people you're fighting for. And never, ever let anyone tell you that questioning authority is wrong. Authority that can't withstand questions isn't worth preserving. I don't know what kind of man you've become, but I hope you're someone who protects rather than uses, who asks for consent rather than demanding obedience, who builds trust rather than exploiting it. I hope you're free. Harry Potter, age 15. P.S. Give my regards to Winky if she's still around. She taught me that the smallest voices sometimes speak the loudest truths. Harry sealed the letter in an envelope marked with protective charms that would preserve it for decades, then placed it in the small trunk that contained his most precious possessions. Someday, when the war was over and he had grown into whatever kind of man he was meant to become, he would read it again and remember the promises he had made to himself when he first learned what freedom meant. Outside his window, the sun was setting over the Burrow's gardens, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, Voldemort was rebuilding his power, gathering his forces, preparing for a war that would test every principle Harry had embraced. There would be battles to fight, choices to make, sacrifices to consider. But for now, Harry Potter was 15 years old, surrounded by people who loved him without conditions, free to choose his own path forward. He had learned to speak for himself, to question authority, to demand better from the world around him. He had learned to live. And that, perhaps, was the greatest magic of all. Not the power to defeat dark wizards or fulfill ancient prophecies, but the courage to claim ownership of his own life and use it according to his own values. The boy who had lived was finally learning how to live well, and the wizarding world would never be the same. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The story was just beginning. End of What If Winky the House Elf testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch Sr. knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along. Final word count, approximately 120,000 characters across 12 chapters. Truth spoken is truth preserved. Silence changes nothing. Winky, formerly of the Crouch household first house elf, granted citizenship in magical Britain, July 1995,